Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Neil, for bringing me on. I'm honored to speak to you all, and I got lots of great information to share.
Nice, man. Let's do it. Okay, take it away.
All right. So we'll go ahead and share the screen here. Okay, and let me start it from the beginning. So as Neil was mentioning, the talk is entitled Free Energy, How Holistic Science Philosophy Can Change the World. So what we're going to be covering here is what I would consider highly advanced information. And basically what I'm going to attempt to do is I'm going to attempt to teach you the keys to abundance. So, what are the things that society, free energy, and consciousness all have the ability to do? Well, they all have the ability to produce abundance. Free energy is itself an expression of abundance, the ability to draw energy out of some type of an environment to put it in good use. So with this principles, these kind of spiritual high-level principles, we're going to be able to take this understanding and apply it personally in our lives. And then we're going to be able to apply it to the world to actually have like a master recipe to make the world a better place. So again, this is going to be some fairly advanced information. So is there a connection between free energy, self-mastery, social harmony, and abundance? So the common element of all these is their product, abundance. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So some of the factors that lead into this are coherence, receptivity, fractality. These all govern free energy devices, consciousness, and societies. So this knowledge that I'm going to be giving you here today, this is something I've been accumulating for many years. It's a kind of distillation of many different types of research, because I'm a pretty heavy, what I would call an archetypal thinker. So I'd like to think about a lot of the things that I'm studying, and I noticed that there was a big connection between all these things. So we're going to cover all that today. So first, we're going to go over free energy. So the way I'm going to lay this information out is I'm going to speak about the principles that govern free energy devices, and then I'm going to use these same principles to describe how your own consciousness works, the very body vehicle that you have to express your life and your spiritual essence. And then we're going to take those same principles and we're going to see how that we can use them to understand how to make a golden age society. So as we go through this, I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. I'm going to try to re-emphasize the same points that are most important. And we're going to look at the same kind of concept from multiple different angles, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to be covering here, it's so abstract and it's such a kind of a universal law principle. So we need to look at it from multiple angles in order to really get a full grasp and understanding of it. So first, let's define what free energy is. So free energy refers to an energy generating device that has the capacity to output more usable energy than it needs to operate. So that's what we mean by producing more energy or free energy. So some examples of free energy devices is the repulsine, which is Victor Schauberger's device. He developed that in the early 20th century. And his work was actually hijacked by the Nazis to make their secret space program, Nazi secret space program technology. And then that technology was later used by the Americans and other agencies. And then we also have the Searle device, Searle effect generator. So those are two really good examples. I chose those examples specifically because you can go online and you can find a lot of really great research to substantiate or to prove to yourself everything I'm going to be talking to you about here. So when we talk about free energy, it's important to remember we're not talking about free as in it comes out of nowhere. It's free in the sense that it's freely available in the environment. It's there. If we can just figure out a way to access it, then we can use it to our advantage. So another term that we hear a lot when we talk about free energy is over-unity. What the heck does that mean? Well, over-unity refers to the ratio of energy needed to run a device versus its output. If it takes 10 energy units to operate a device that produces 15 energy units of output, that means we have an over-unity effect of 150% efficiency. So the free energy comes from the over-unity effect. And a really good kind of interesting fact to consider here is a lot of ufologists, so the people who study UFOs and extraterrestrials and things like this, they assert that extraterrestrials and the deep state and the secret space program, they also use free energy technology. We're actually going to look at one of those examples briefly today. What's going on here? There we go. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over some of the bigger principles of kind of like, what are the ingredients that we need in order to create a free energy dish, so to speak, to use a cooking analogy. Well, I've kind of boiled these down for you, again, because a lot of this stuff is fairly high level concepts, and I wanted to make it very easy to understand. So that's what we're going to go over here. So first, we have a device that draws energy from the environment through a coherent open system design. We're going to go over that. But really, the thing that allows us to get energy out of the environment is a device. We need something to actually grab that energy out. Well, where does this energy come from? Well, in a great many free energy devices, not all of them, but in a great many free energy devices, the supply of energy comes from the 0 point, or what's called the vacuum. So how do we actually get this energy out of the vacuum? Well, one of the mechanisms for this is entrainment. And entrainment is itself a mechanism whereby if you take a device and you resonate it or you tune it to the source of where this free energy is hanging out, then it will naturally start to flow towards the device and you can use it for some purpose. And that's what entrainment is. It's also the base in the science of sympathetic vibratory physics. So resonance with the 0 point, this is what actually allows us to access the energy. So the device is the thing that allows you to grab the energy. We tune it to the 0 point. That's where the energy is actually stored. And then it's the resonance with the 0 point that allows us to access this energy. Now, when we talk about open systems, what we're talking about is a method of understanding. So in this presentation, specifically in this section, I'm going to describe like the kind of the hard science, but then I'm also going to speak to how we as human beings understand this hard science. And that's really important, especially from a free energy perspective, because a lot of the critics of free energy, I would say that they lack the necessary philosophy skills in hand to properly understand what the free energy proponents are saying. So I'm going to actually give you those philosophy skills today. So you can so you will be basically an expert on this, and you'll have a really good firsthand understanding of how this free energy science works. So what an open system is it's a system that has the ability to gather energy from an environment as well as the energy that it outputs. So an open system is something that has the ability to feed back on itself. And because of this feedback effect, it has the ability to purify the process of gathering the energy as well as enhancing it and building it up in the system. So a really good example of this, an analogy I should say, is if you imagine this quote unquote free energy is like kindling everywhere in a forest. So if you want to build a fire and you're in the middle of a forest, there's probably all pieces of wood floating around everywhere, but you can't actually use them. You need to do something in order to use that kindling so you can make a fire. And in effect, you are the device in this analogy. You go out and you gather up this free energy. You gather up this wood and then you bring it into a central location so that it can be used to start a fire. So an open system is that type of a system. We're going to be going over all that in much detail. So now we're going to break down the actual principles from a high level science perspective that actually makes a free energy device work. And again, we're going to go over this in much detail. So don't necessarily feel like you have to memorize this stuff. I'm going to, like I said, tell you about these principles from multiple different angles so that you have a really good, rich understanding. So first thing is called constructive wave interference. This is what focuses all the random energy in the environment so that it can be gathered and used in a specific device. And energy systems themselves are directional. So what the constructive wave interference is referring to is our ability through this device to take those directions of energy. You imagine that, everything's pointing in a whole bunch of different directions. But we need to get those directions to all point in the same place, in the same center, so that the energy can flow into that place so we can use it. And that's what constructive wave interference refers to. It's the ability of two waves to add together. And the process, the main engine that allows the energy that's in the environment to flow towards the center is what's called a fractal field. So draws in and compresses energy and information into itself. So this is the science that we're going to use to understand how free energy devices work. So what is the mechanism that allows different pieces of energy to weave together so it can be drawn into the center? Well, that's called fractal embedding. So that's the actual technique. We're going to use this fractal field, this electromagnetic field, to gather up all this energy that's in the environment, and then we're going to weave it together like a tapestry, like a weaving of threads to create a piece of cloth, very similar to that. And that's the fractal embedding statement, or that concept is the technique that we use to do that. And then the effect that that causes is what's called fractal implosion. So when you take this free energy device, it produces an electromagnetic field that we would call fractal. And we call it a fractal because it has the ability to compress in energy and information into itself. And that creates an implosive effect. So it's taking energy that's hanging out in the environment and it's drawing it into the center. And the method by which that happens is called constructive wave interference again. Now, what is the output of a free energy device? Well, the output is a fractal explosion. So what you think of is that in order to create this implosive effect, we're compressing all this energy and information in, and it gets stored. So that means we're building up energy in a device. And then once we release it, it's a kind of explosion. Well, it's a fractal explosion in the sense that it's a very coherent, organized explosion. It's not just a kind of like random explosion. It's a very laser-like kind of clean type of explosion. So now let's actually get into how this free energy process works. So here, I added this image of an alien reproduction vehicle because I want to show you that in most of these free energy devices, we have a center where the energy is being stored. And if you look at, unfortunately, you probably can't see my mouse, but if you look at the outer edge of this alien reproduction vehicle, there's these components along the outer edge, and the surface itself. This particular design, I believe this comes from Michael McCandish, if I believe. And his design is very complete insofar as describing the science. So if you really wanted to get a really heady explanation of what the electromagnetic physics involved is, you can look at this work. But the real point I wanted to emphasize here is that there's a center point, and this energy is going to be stored in the center point, and it's going to be used for some purpose. And in this particular case, once this free energy device is turned on, the energy gets stored and builds up inside the device. It creates a field around the UFO, or the alien reproduction vehicle, that actually shields it from space-time so it can make all these fancy maneuvers. And it can also, depending on what they want to do with it, it can even cross into different time zones and things like this. So that happens because the device itself acts like an implosive kind of well. It draws energy from the environment, and then it stores it in a center point so it can be used for various purposes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cover some of the essential knowledge of the kind of the physics behind how free energy devices work. So in order to do this properly, we have to get to the essence of what some of these things are. It's really easy when we're talking about these something like free energy to throw around these terms, but if we don't define them properly, it's hard for us to have a deep substantive understanding. And I want everybody to have a deep, rich understanding of what this means. I prefer not to have any blind faith out there as much as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define very clearly a lot of terms that we've probably heard before. And this is going to give you a very rich, deep, in philosophy, it's called an epistemological foundation. So it's a really deep foundation for understanding how this works. You're going to gain intrinsic knowledge. And we're actually going to define intrinsic knowledge a little bit later. So this is all going to become really important as we go on. So how is an over-unity effect achieved? Well, all energy expresses itself as a structure, a geometric orientation of spatial and temporal components that we perceive as information. So what I'm basically saying by that is that when you think of energy, this energy creates some shape, and that shape is itself something that exists in time and space as a structure. What that means is that the information in that structure is the geometry, the shape that it looks like. And what the connection that we want to make here is that all energy, as it expresses itself in the universe, has to have some structure to it. It has a shape to it that we can see. And because it has a shape, that means we can take another device or another system, like a field, and we can actually arrange that so that we can work with the components to do something useful with that energy. So if you're not familiar with what we're looking at here to the right, this is a cymatics photograph. This is actually a series of plates where sand was placed on the plates and a vibrating, the plates were vibrated at a specific frequency to produce these different shapes. So what we're seeing here is that depending on the frequency, it actually changes the spatial orientation. It changes the shape. So what this slide it proves to us is it proves that energy always expresses itself as some type of structure. And because the structure has relationships, it means that there's also an information in there. So energy and directions. The other thing that we need to consider is that energy expresses itself in some type of direction. So energy flows somewhere. If you're thinking about a river, the river flows from uphill to downhill. If you're thinking about the sun, the light from the sun comes from the sun and it flows outwardly in all directions in a radial pattern to hit all the planets and everything in the solar system. So energy, for the most part, not in all cases, but for the most part, has a flow. It always has a direction. And because it has a direction, we can line up these directions so that they add together constructively. So an electromagnetic field organizes the directions of energy so we can use it in a purpose. So we can measure energy as waves. So we can, when I say measure energy as waves, it allows us to understand what the energy is. And because we have that understanding, we can use that same science of understanding waves to then understand how free energy devices work and ultimately how consciousness works. So what you see here on the left, what is a pendulum swinging. And this swinging pendulum, if you ignore the graph part on the right-hand side, you would just imagine this pendulum swinging. It oscillates. So what we're talking about here is an oscillation. So if you look to the left of this diagram, you see G. These are different points that are plotted as the pendulum swings back and forth. When you look at G, that's when the velocity is 0. So if you think about a pendulum, when the pendulum's moving at the center point, that's when it's fastest. And then when it moves up, that's when it starts to slow down because of the force of gravity. And then it hits its peak. It actually stops very briefly for a moment. So if you think about this, if you look at all these points, and then you look at the graph, the velocity graph here, notice that the G and the A points are always at the 0 line. So what that means is that at points A and G, there's no velocity. Now, when they're at the D, that means that the velocity is the highest, but the direction is different. And that's why it looks like a sine wave. This is why it looks like a wave. So really the main point I want to get at here, the thing that you should walk away from, is that we can measure and understand how energy flows as a direction and as a wave. And because of that, that's going to allow us to create devices that work with where the components work with each other so that we can draw energy out of the field. So again, we talked about energy and information. Now we're going to really solidify it even more. So energy and information are one. They're two sides of the same coin. Anytime there's information present, there's also energy. Anytime there's energy present, there's also information. So all information is itself a configuration of energy vibrations creating a unique object or thing, either materially or metaphysically. So when we think about an object from a physics standpoint, they're actually what we call standing waves of vibrational energy. So nothing is truly still or motionless in the universe. And that's something that even modern day science and physics acknowledges. So if you've ever heard of the phrase, everything is vibration, that is itself one of the 7 Hermetic principles or 7 natural laws. And what it's basically describing is that everything you think is solid is actually this undulating, pulsating thing, which means that there's energy in there. There's something happening. There's energy and there's information and that we can draw from. And when I say standing wave, it means is that the flow of energy itself, it produces a cyclic static motion. So if you look at the right-hand side here, I took an image, it's actually a GIF, of a drain, a bathtub draining. And what you see here is that the shape of the whirlpool, it basically stays the same. It oscillates a little bit. But everything that makes that shape what it is actually moving, it's flowing. So every object that you can think of, every concept even, idea, is not really a fixed thing. It's not like a billiard ball where it just sits there. It's actually itself a flowing, undulating system. And that's what we call a standing wave. If you really want another fancy term, it's in quantum physics, it's called a dissipative state. And what's interesting is that we are dissipative states. So you like to think of yourself as like, oh, I'm this, I'm that, I have, these beliefs, I have that belief, I'm, this person, I'm that type of person. Well, those things are itself expressions of this flowing undulation, this constant flow that is your beingness. And then as well, society is the same way. We have certain societies and groups and cultural norms and things like this. But those things aren't really fixed. They're not in static. They're actually themselves these flowing, undulating systems. So the point I want to have you walk away from here in this case is that everything you could think of in the universe, particularly energy, your own consciousness, and how societies work, are themselves dynamic flowing systems. And by understanding them as dynamic flowing systems, we can better work with them to produce the things we want. So here we're going to talk about constructive wave interference. So this is kind of the main engine that fuels the fractal field effect. So remember, the fractal field is the thing that creates the implosion. If you took a fractal field and you threw it out, let's say you had a big messy floor and there was a lot of confetti everywhere because you just had a party. Well, if I gave you a magical cleaning device that had a fractal field in it, and you put it in the room with all the confetti everywhere, and you turned the fractal field on, what would happen is all of that confetti would naturally start to flow into the center. And that's what a fractal field does. It creates an implosion effect. Well, the method that is used in the free energy device is what's called constructive wave interference. So when two or more waves add together non-destructively, the energy and information of each combines to form a new wave that is reflective of its parents. And I specifically used an anthropomorphic analogy or statement there, parents, because what we're essentially referring to is these waves basically generate some new wave. It's like they're having a child. So if you look on the left-hand side, which is the image for this slide, on the top graph, you have a waveform. And the amplitude, or the peak of this at point B of the red line, is a value of 1. So the strength of this first wave is 1. If you look to the second wave, you see that the value of the wave is 2. The amplitude is 2. And because the waves start off and move down with each other, that's called being in phase. So in other words, they move up, the peaks match and the troughs match. This is what's called a wave that's in phase. And because the wave is in phase, these waves can add together, and the energy and information in these waves will combine. And that's what you see in this third wave. So what's happening is that the free energy device is taking these two different sources of energy, these two different waves of energy, and it's using the fractal fields to tune them and orient them to change their direction so that they can line up with each other and go in phase. And then when that happens, the two waves combine, and you get a new wave that has the same energy value of the combining two previous waves and the same information. And that's what you see in the third wave here. That's why the amplitude of this third wave, or the peak, is a value of 3. So free energy devices are designed to absorb incoming energy. A really good example of this, if all this is a little confusing for you, think about it like this. I want you to imagine two people trying to pull a rock in opposite directions. You have one person on one side with a rope, you have another person on another side with a rope. They're both pulling with 100 pounds of force, but in opposite directions. Well, what happens? It's like a tug of war. The rock's probably not going to move anywhere, is it? Well, that's because those two forces are adding together destructively. Well, if one of the people goes to the other side and they follow and they partner up with that other person, if they combine forces, if they get on the same page with each other and have really good communications and work out what their mutual goals are so they can work together, then they can both combine their energy and move that rock. And they can move it further than they would have if they tried to do it individually. So that's what I'm talking about, constructive wave interference here. It's that we're taking these two energy systems, we're taking, whether we're talking about a person, we're talking about components of a free energy device, we're talking about ideas in your own mind, when you orient those properly so that they can work together in harmony, then you can do more with that. Those forces and information add together. And that's what we're describing here with constructive wave interference. So components in resonance. So every free energy device has components. It has parts to it. And these parts have to work together to focalize the incoming energy of the whole system to a central point. So each part is in resonance with the whole system and other parts, ensuring energy flows add together constructively. So when we say in resonance, we mean that they can vibrate in the same frequency. And we're going to have a whole slide on resonance, but just to further emphasize this point, if you think about music, if anybody's ever heard live music before, all of the musicians on the stage or in the orchestra, they're all tuned to each other. And the reason the music sounds as beautiful as it does is because they're all in resonance. So they're all working off of the same baseline frequency. If a musician, let's say, breaks a string or doesn't tune, maybe they show up late to the performance and they don't have a time to tune and they start playing, you can hear it pretty easily when they're not in tune with each other. Well, it's just what I'm describing here. The analogy is that when something isn't in resonance, it can't work with the other things that are in resonance with each other. So when a musician is playing out of key, when they're playing the wrong note, you as the audience, you can hear that very easily. So using that concept of being in tune, now apply that same concept to a free energy device. All of the components in a free energy device work together in some fashion to produce some whole. And then that's what I'm describing here with this diagram. You don't necessarily have to know the technical aspects, but imagine that each of these arrows is itself a component. It's like a part. All these parts are going to work together so that the flow of their output is all going to move towards the center to create this flowing energy effect so it can be used for some purpose. So addition of energy vectors for implosion. Each component of a free energy device directionalizes energy toward another component in an additive fashion via the electromagnetic field. So in other words, these components, they push and pull in harmony with each other. And because of that, their motions can add together. And that's what creates this inward flowing effect. That's also what creates the torus. Now, what's interesting is that the torus is itself the most efficient and organized system for energy flow in the universe. In particular, in physics, we call it fluid flow or fluid dynamics. So plasma, electromagnetic energies, things like this, air, water, we refer to them as fluids because they can move. And the most organized shape for a dynamic system of fluids, whether we're talking about plasma energy or energy itself or water or air, is a torus. So what's interesting here is that we're using the most efficient dynamic system that we've ever discovered, which is a torus. We can use that principle, that geometry, that shape, to create a free energy device. And in many cases, a lot of the very highly advanced free energy devices, especially the ones that are allegedly used by extraterrestrials, according to some researchers and insiders, they all have this toroidal kind of shape. So now we're going to get into fractal embedding. So we talked about how constructive wave interference allows two energy systems that are out in the environment that are maybe pointing in different directions. When we put the fractal field in the center of them, the fractal field is going to start to move those energy flows so that they work together and they start pushing energy into the same place. So in order to understand how that process works, let's talk about fractals. We're going to get to the essence of what a fractal is. Give me 1 second to just take a little chug of water here. So fractals are self-similar patterns that non-destructively represent information from the outside on the inside and vice versa. A fractal is the only pattern that can compress information without loss of fidelity as time goes on. So what we mean by that is that a fractal is like the master recipe for taking things that are not organized and organizing them holistically and continuing to pack them and embed them and weave them together. So if you think about it, to use an analogy, let's say you're living in a house and you just moved in and there's boxes everywhere and there's crap all over the place and your kitchen's a mess, there's things all over the place. You open up one cabinet, there's like a cup, there's a plate, there's a utensil, but there's also baking soda, there's also food, you maybe even got like a sock in there, so it's really disorganized. What a fractal is going to do in this analogy is it's kind of like the person who comes in to completely organize your house. The fractal is going to take all the various places, objects in your house and in your kitchen, and it's going to put them in the best place so that you can use all of those objects in your house with the greatest efficiency, and you know exactly where everything is right when you need it. That's what a fractal is doing for a free energy device. That's also what a fractal does for us in consciousness, except when we refer to it in consciousness, we use the term spirituality. So the spirituality is itself a master organizing principle, just like a fractal. The fractal is designed to organize systems of energy inside of it so that they can be compressed and stored efficiently. So I'm going to use just one more analogy because this is like a really critical concept. Imagine if you've ever moved anywhere, if you're packing or even just going on a trip. And when you pack objects into your bag or into a box, what's the best way to do it? To just, take the things on your bed or on the floor or wherever you're staging them and just dump them in without even thinking about it? Or is it better to carefully arrange each of the objects so that the space is used the most efficiently? Well, I'm hoping that you come to the conclusion that it's organizing them that is the most efficient insofar as putting the most items in that space. Well, what a fractal is again, it's the system that we're going to use to pack energy and information into a confined space. And what's really interesting is that the fractal can do that perpetually with energy and information. Literally, the information that we pump into this fractal, it isn't lost. And I'm going to have a really good description of that here in a moment. So mathematically, one of the ways that we can describe what a fractal is through the golden mean or phi ratio. And that's kind of what you see here in this GIF that's moving. It is a numerical or a mathematical representation of a fractal, making it a mathematical recipe for over-unity systems. So when we want to study an over-unity device, if we can find in our studying of the device geometry or geometric relationships that are in the phi or golden mean ratio, then we know that it's very likely that this device or this object is tuned to the universe in such a way that it has the ability to draw energy out of the 0 point and draw energy that's freely available in the environment. Now, what's interesting is that your own body has tons of golden mean ratio and fractal relationships, which means that your own body is itself a type of free energy device. But like all types of free energy devices, they have to be properly tuned. And when you tune your own body, which requires mind and heart integration, then you can literally tap into the energy in the field. This is kind of what a little bit we're touching in the idea of like breatharianism and things like this, or even the ability to access information from the Akashic, which we're going to get into. So what I just want to leave you with here on this slide is if we look at this beautiful swirling diagram, if you look at the center where this spiral is emerging from, notice that as the spiral opens up, it kind of repeats itself. And it's also, the outside spiral looks very similar to the one that's on the inside. That's what the fractal is. It's called self-similarity. The outside looks like the inside. And that capacity to organize the outside in the inside means that all the information that we dump into this thing is stored without loss. So what do I mean by stored without loss? We're going to use an analogy here. So I want you to imagine a normal hard drive, just a regular old hard drive. Let's say you can store 1,000 photos on this hard drive in 10 gigabytes of space. That's the most. So if you try to add any more photos, then the photos are going to start to degrade because of compression. So if you're not familiar with that term, basically what happens is when you take a photo, it's going to capture everything in real time. It's going to capture all the light and store that information in a really high definition photo, but it tends to be a fairly large photo. And in many cases, if you want to upload the photo to YouTube or Facebook or something like that, it'll compress the photo. It'll take the size of the photo and it'll strip away some of the detail. And that's effectively what would happen on a normal hard drive. So if you try to add more than the 1,000 photos on this imaginary hard drive, the loss of quality is going to continue. So let's imagine that you took and you tried to put 10,000 photos on this hard drive that can only store 1,000 photos without loss. Well, that means now all those 10,000 photos, they are going to be there, but they're going to be really low-fi. They might going to be blurry. They're going to have that weird like compression look to them. which means that we're losing information every time we compress it in this normal hard drive. But when we use fractal embedding, the hard drive never loses the ability to store information because it can keep compressing it and compressing it and compressing it. So that's what the power of a fractal is. It has the ability to store information without actually losing the quality of the information. And again, your mind has the capacity to do the same thing. Of course, we weren't taught how to do this by the deep state because the deep state don't want us to have that ability. But there are people who have learned how to do this throughout history. Leonardo da Vinci, arguably Nikola Tesla. We have, I mean, there's countless people, Rene Descartes, Kent, I'm trying to think of one in particular. Oh, Walter Russell, who inspired Tesla, and a whole bunch of other people. You know, Buckminster Fuller is probably another one of these people. When you have the ability to self-teach, it's called being an autodidact, which I'm going to teach you how to do in this presentation, then you're going to have the ability to derive and create more knowledge from the same body of information you have, and that knowledge will continue to expand in your own consciousness. And that's exactly what this fractal embedding does. So now let's talk about open systems and feedback. So often, if you've ever tried to talk to somebody about free energy devices, they say, oh, well, you know, you can't, free energy devices aren't real because they violate the second law of thermodynamics. They violate the conservation of energy. There are no such thing as free energy devices because you can't have energy coming from nowhere. But what they're referring to is systems that are closed or isolated. So we're going to talk about those now, and then I'm going to give you a little secret that most physicists don't understand. So first, let's talk about an isolated system. So an isolated system is completely cut off from the environment, so that when we say system, we have an output and an input. So the input of where the energy is coming into the system is localized in the system. So let's give it some, let's create a specific analogy here. So imagine you have a motor that runs off of gasoline and it's inside of a room. If it was an isolated system, that means the fuel for the motor is inside that room. And that's where the energy is drawn from. And then the output of that motor is also inside the room. So maybe the gas motor is like spinning a flywheel or something like that. Well, all the fuel from that flywheel has to come inside that room. That's what's in an isolated system. And then it's completely sealed off from the environment in an isolated system. So it can't actually interact with anything outside of that room. In a closed system, it's similar to an isolated system, except the output can go outside of the room, but the input is inside the system. So to use the same analogy of the engine in a room, imagine in this case that the fuel is still inside the room, but now the flywheel or the spinning of the motor is actually outside the room. It can actually spin outside. So that's what's called a closed system. Now, an open system is when the input and the output are connected to each other and connected to the environment. So this is when the output of the flywheel, so the spinning of the flywheel, it might actually be able to help put fuel inside the device itself. Maybe you've rigged some type of gear pulley system so that if the flywheel spins after 5 minutes, then another like cup of gasoline will be dumped inside the tank, something like that. So that's called a feedback effect. So over unity systems are all open systems for the most part, in the sense that the output of the energy can feed back into the device. And that feedback effect does two things usually. That builds up energy into the system, right? Just like if you're familiar with, if you've ever been to a concert or any type of place where there's a microphone and a PA system set up, what happens when the guy who's using the microphone gets too close to the speaker? Well, what happens is that the sound that's coming from the speaker is going back into the microphone, and then it's being projected back out in the speaker, and it creates this positive feedback loop, this cascading feedback loop that keeps getting louder and louder and louder to the point where you hear this really loud shriek, and you're like, whoa, what the heck is that? Well, that is an open system feedback. That's exactly what we're talking about when we think of free energy devices. Now, here's the little secret. The little secret is there's no such thing as closed and isolated systems. They don't actually exist in reality. The only thing that exists in reality is an open system. So when a physicist comes or somebody is trying to say, oh man, you know, free energy devices, you're crazy, those things don't exist. You can't have free energy devices because there's no way for the output to feed back into the input, you know, if they even get that fancy on you. Well, now you know. Now you know that that's not actually true. So be tactful and graceful with this information, but realize that the very people, the arbiters of truth, the gatekeepers of wisdom and knowledge when it comes to the science, they themselves don't know. And I can say this personally because I went to school for physics, so I know firsthand exactly what I'm talking about here. I saw all this in my thermodynamics class when I was in school. So now we're going to talk about how fractals actually store information. So earlier we talked about how a fractal field can help us organize information that's not organized outside of itself or outside of the system because the directions need to be aligned together. We talked about how the fractal, once those systems embed, they're going to use constructive wave interference so that the waves all flow with each other precisely. And then that's going to create a buildup of energy in the system that we can use to do something. So what does it actually look like when we talk about embedding? Well, there's a word that we can use to refer to this continual detail adding, you might say, that's taking place. It's called repleteness. So normally we think of something being complete, like it has enough of the pieces there to say, oh yes, that's definitely something. So for example, let's look at this to the right, upper right of this image, we see kind of the Star of David on the second position. Well, I can say that, oh, well, this Star of David is complete. All the pieces that we need in order to call it a Star of David are there, or six-pointed star if you prefer that term. Well, what a fractal does is it adds more detail. It's still a complete Star of David, but now there's more detail there. There's more richness. That's what the term repleteness refers to. And what fractals do is they take whatever the complete essence, the theme, the thing is there, and they make it more replete. They make it more like itself. That's what a fractal is designed to do. And that's also what we are doing. So when our consciousness itself works off of a fractal, spirituality is itself a kind of the conscious technique of using the order-making principle of a fractal to make your own beingness replete. So when you pursue the spiritual path, it's like you're making yourself more like yourself over time. And then arguably the focus of, you know, where the source of your growth is ultimately the creator of all things, in my opinion. But the point is here is what we wanted to understand is that as the fractal embedding process proceeds, okay, so as the free energy device is gathering energy and it's building up in the system, it's making the organization and the order in that system more replete. And so what happens in a fractal is, if you look up at the top left, these are iterations. So what an iteration is the way a fractal works, it's an equation, and it's an equation in series. So the first time you put in the value for the equation, you get an output. Then you take that output, you dump it back into the equation, and you run the equation again. And then you keep doing that. And every time you do that, it's called an iteration. It's like a step. So if you look up at the top left, this is the fractal that without any iteration. So you might be the 0 point. Or let me not use that term to confuse anything. This is the first, or the before we've actually applied the fractal. And then if you look up at the top, or the triangle-like pyramid underneath this first line, what the fractal is designed to do is it's designed to take any straight line, cut it in half, and then add two other lines next to it at an angle. And that's what you see here, this kind of like mountain shape. And then if you take that same formula and you apply it to the same shape again, so we're feeding back into itself, what happens? You get the third line, which is now you have the same mountain shape on the two sides, but then you also have it on the sides of the mountain itself. And then that just keeps going. And so you keep adding more and more detail. Well, if you notice, the same basic shape is preserved. It's still there, but it's becoming more and more detailed. And that's what we're referring to as fractal repleteness. And then these other two are just two other expressions or examples of that concept. So here's some more fractals. They're really pretty. This one I have actually on my Facebook back wall here on the left. Really amazing. This is the Mandelbrot set. And on the right-hand side, we have a three-dimensional fractal. This is actually cauliflower. So earlier I was talking about perfect explosion. Well, one of the interesting things is that living systems are actually a type of free energy device. They're an over-unity device. And the way our body is created is through what you might call a fractal explosion. So the energy and the life force energy that's flowing into us from our mother and from the environment is feeding us in the womb. And our DNA is kind of like the fractal field. It's organizing that energy, and it's creating an explosion. And that explosion is you. That's your body. That's what's being created. That's why there's so many golden mean ratios in your own body. It's because we are living fractals in a sense. We are the fruit, the expression of a fractal shape. So here, I'm just going to play this really briefly. What this is it's called a fractal zoom. And the point I'm trying to get you to see here is that as the fractal gathers information, it can compress it very easily into the system. And it will look similar. So as we start to dive down into this fractal, you're going to see a lot of similarities, but it's never going to be precisely the same. So what this means is that information is being stored deeper and deeper. And the more we go into this, the more and more information can be stored. So literally, we can conceivably store a well-nigh infinite amount of information here. And just to typify that point even more, if anybody's familiar with Nassim Haramein, he talks about bounded infinity. And what a bounded infinity is it's the idea that you can take a space, and if you slice up that space in a specific type of way, then you can keep, every time you keep slicing the space, you're going to keep adding more and more differentiation, more informational points. And even though the space is limited, inside the space, you have a kind of infinity. Another good example of this is in numbers. If I asked you to divide the number 1 in half, and I asked you how many times could you divide those halves, and when would that process end? Well, it wouldn't end. You could keep dividing it an infinite number of times, and you would have an infinite number of divisions between 0 and 1. So what that means is that life itself is kind of this grand expression of infinities, which is a kind of a deeper concept. But the point I'm getting at here is that where fractals are themselves the ability to store information and compress it in an infinite type of a sense, and the universe itself is based on that. So when we understand how to work with these grand spiritual principles of the universe, we can not only create free energy, but we can learn how to master ourselves, gain self-mastery, gain enlightenment, gain true sovereignty, and then we can literally make the world a better place through our efforts. So let's take a look at this for a second here. Again, you can go on YouTube, you can search for this. It's really pretty. What we're seeing here is that the fractal itself, again, like the organizing shape, it has the ability to keep storing more and more information. The deeper you go, the more information can be compact and compressed, and it's never lost. It's always there, and it's all through self-similarity. So yeah, this is real pretty. So I'll go ahead and stop this right here. I suggest everybody, if you want to look at that, it's about 10 minutes long. Look it up on YouTube. It's really nice. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a fractal field. So we already covered a lot of the components. Now we're going to look at it from a different angle. So a fractal field is any field phenomenon that has the capacity to compress energy and information non-destructively, causing implosion. So a free energy device produces a fractal field through the components. So a fractal brings order to chaos. So earlier we talked about constructive wave interference, that when two waves are in phase, they can add together to produce a new wave that has the energy and information of the two parents. That's what we're looking at when we see this diagram on the left, this GIF on the left here. When the red wave is at its highest, that's when the waves are completely in phase. So in order for it to actually create a fractal field effect, in order to have the waves add together, we need to make them in phase. They have to walk the same path. They have to be on the same page. They have to walk hand in hand. Okay, and I'm using these analogies for a specific reason, because the same basic principle that allows us to add two waves together, we can apply to consciousness to allow two ideas that are similar to add together to create new knowledge. And when you take two people or more and you allow them to communicate effectively through honorable means, then they can get on the same page to work together to do something. So phase conjugation, that's the scientific term that refers to when two waves are added together. So if you can imagine, if waves are not added together, they're going to be canceling. So if you look at this graph, when the blue wave matches with the green wave such that the peak and the trough are not in alignment, then the red line goes to 0. So that means they cancel each other out. That's destructive wave interference. When excuse me, when the peaks and the troughs of the blue and the yellow line, or I'm sorry, the blue and the green line line up with each other, that's called phase conjugation or constructive wave interference. So in order to, you have to get the waves together. They have to be hand in hand. They have to start at the same place, okay? So if that term conjugal should hopefully be familiar to you, and there's a reason why it's conjugal. You ever heard of the term conjugal visit before? Somebody in prison, their wife goes to visit them. They get a little freaky in the prison cell. They feel really good. But what's happening is that their two aspects are coming together. They're joining together. And then what can happen sometimes? Sometimes new life can be created, just like this wave. That when the two waves add together, a new wave gets created. That's the sum of the total. So the real point I want to get at here is that in order for us to create the fractal field effect, in order to actually have the two waves add together, in order for two energy components to add together constructively so we can use something, they have to be in harmony with each other. They have to be in resonance. They have to work with each other hand in hand. So fractals and implosion. So now we're going to review these concepts again and really solidify them. So implosion is the collapsing of something inwardly, which is the opposite of an explosion. Fractals are naturally implosive because information on the outside can be stored on the inside, creating an inward flow of energy and information. Fractal implosion and explosion results in an internally organized system of information and energy, the output of which is perfect explosion, a highly coherent laser beam of energy that can be used for various purposes. And possibly you've made this conclusion on your own, but if not, I'm going to go ahead and tell you now that this implosion and explosion effect is very similar to a gendered archetype. So the feminine energy, the feminine archetype is receptivity. Okay, so when we talk about something being feminine, we're talking about receiving, of being open to something. The fractal field itself, that implosive field, that is the feminine energy. What a fractal field is doing is it's embracing the divine feminine concept that allows it to draw energy from the system so it can be centralized to a central output. Once it has been done and it builds up enough, then it can turn into a masculine output. It can be expressed as perfect order externally. So when we create perfect order inside of us, now I'm expanding that concept to discuss consciousness. So yourself, when you take the time to gain internal order through organizing your information in conscious philosophy, then you can create perfect order outside of yourself. This is why the sages and masters of the ages, the prophets of the ages, always talked about doing the inner work, because you can't fix the outside world if you haven't fixed the inside world. So here we have an example of what a fractal explosion. This is an actual snowflake. I don't have too much time to go into the physics involved, but what basically happens is there's stuff called easy water, or extrusion layer water, H3O2. If you take a point, like a little piece of dust, it's a cloud condensation nuclei, and you put it in water and then you cool that water down, well, easy water is going to build up around that little condensation nuclei. And what the easy water basically is it's a highly organized field, okay? And then as that field comes together, it starts to solidify, and at the very center point, you actually start to have this geometric freezing effect where this highly ordered structure starts to emerge, kind of like an explosion. So what we have literally in the creation of a snowflake is an example of this implosive effect from the easy water. And then as the implosion effect cools the water so that it can be frozen and create a crystalline structure, we have an explosive, highly organized explosive effect. So again, when we talk about explosion here, we're not talking about, big bang boom, Hollywood explosions where people die and horrible things like this. No, what we're talking about is life. Life is itself an explosion. And if you learn how to use your consciousness and organize your own thoughts precisely, you can create perfect order outside of yourself. So where does this 0 point energy come from? We're going to cover that right now. So scientists observed a long time ago, if they tried to cool an object to absolute zero, so this is something they've been trying to do for a long time. They wanted to reach the coldest temperature humanly possible, which was theorized in the 1900s. I believe his name was Lord Kelvin. He developed the temperature measurement system called Kelvin's, and that is based on the idea that we can't actually cool something to zero. But when they tried to do this, they kept cooling and cooling and cooling and cooling, and they noticed that after a certain point, no matter how much they tried to cool this, whatever the substance they were trying to cool, it kept vibrating. And what that means is that there was some other energy that this object was pulling out of the system somewhere, and they called that the 0 point, or the vacuum energy. Now, after they made this discovery, they calculated what this vacuum energy might be based on Maxwell's equations, Planck's length, distance, and things like this. And they determined, this is what's mind-blowing, Nassim Haramein talks about this in terms of what's called the vacuum catastrophe, I believe. They calculated that 10 to the 113th joules per cubic meter can be stored in a single cubic meter of energy in the universe. What that means is that it's a 10 with 113 zeros after it. That's a lot of energy. That is more energy in a single cubic meter than all of the visible universe that we can see, by like 60 orders of magnitude. So we're talking about a massive amount of energy that's contained inside the 0 point that they were able to theoretically calculate using a mathematical model. Now, we have an observed measurement that we have to demonstrate this. We already have the 0 point in the sense that we cooled an object, and when we tried to cool that object, it kept vibrating even though we kept cooling it. That is the first point of proof that we know that the 0 point exists. We have a second point of proof as well. We have the Kashmir effect. The Kashmir effect is when you take two plates, you move them really close to each other, and that empty space, if you put them in the right position, they're going to start to push away from each other a little bit. And that's because there's some energy pumping out of the 0 point. So, and that energy is kind of locked away in the vacuum. So just like we were talking about before, with this free energy, when we talk about free energy, we're not necessarily saying it's free like it comes out of nowhere. We're saying it's freely available. It's already out there in the environment. And in the vacuum, there's a ton of energy. Energy is like all over the place, except it's not energy. It's what's happened is that the energy systems that are operating in the vacuum, they're countering each other. So they work they work destructively. So instead of constructive wave interference, we have destructive wave interference. What that means is that these energy flows, instead of moving in phase with each other, they're completely out of phase. So from our perspective, looking at the universe, we see empty space, we see a vacuum. But in reality, there's a ton of energy in there. And quantum physicists described this kind of energy that's locked inside of the vacuum as the quantum foam. Now, another point to really solidify this in is when they do these particle accelerator experiments, they have a whole lot of particles coming out of poofing into existence that weren't there before. And they've termed these matter and antimatter and things like this. So essentially what we're talking about here is that there's a whole lot of data already in the scientific record to give proof or validation for the fact that there really is free energy available in the universe. If we can merely develop a device to access it, we can use it in a productive way. So again, accessing this energy in the 0 point requires us to tune to the universe. So these free energy devices, just like a musician has to tune to the orchestra so he can play with the orchestra. Well, a free energy device has to tune to the environment, has to tune to the universe so we can access the energy that's in the 0 point. So how does this actual access happen? Well, earlier we described it in terms of resonance and entrainment. So now we're going to explain this even more detail. So I want you to imagine for a moment that when we talk about resonance, when something is in resonance with something else, it's like we're creating a bridge, we're creating a connection. And once the two devices are in resonance, once a connection has been formed, they can share energy and information between them. So that's what's happening when we talk about resonance and entrainment. So resonance is the capacity of one system of motion to share energy and information with another system if they share the same innate frequency property determined by geometry and material substance. So what I mean by that is what is the resonance of a system? I don't know if you've ever heard that term before, but you know, the baseline resonant frequency is maybe it's 6 hertz, or if we're thinking about the Earth, for example, the Schumann resonances. I know there's kind of a lot of confusion there with folks about these, but the baseline frequency of the Schumann resonances is 7.86 hertz. That's calculated, so it's the innate property of the Earth based on the space between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth. That, for the most part, doesn't change. So when we talk about resonance of a device, we're talking about how its geometry and its makeup and what the material is. So let's use this pretty simple analogy. Let's say if I have a guitar. So if I want to tune a guitar to a piano, let's say, the piano is going to strike, let's say, middle C. And it's going to strike middle C, and then I'm going to try to play middle C on my guitar, and I'm going to strike that note. And if you've ever tried to tune an instrument before, what you do is you hear, when the notes start to get close together, you hear this kind of like whoop, 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 whoop. And as you tune the tuning peg of the guitar, what's happening is you're either adding tension or you're removing tension. So you're making it tighter or you're making it looser. And you make something tighter, it raises the frequency of the object. If you make it looser, it reduces the frequency, especially in the guitar. So when you're tuning the guitar, you're making its baseline, the actual shape and the tension that's in the guitar itself, to harmonize with the piano. And once that happens, then they're in tune with each other. Now what's interesting is that once a device or two different objects are tuned with each other, now they can share energy and information, like I've been saying. Really good example of that is 2 tuning forks. So if I take 2 tuning forks and they're both tuned to middle C, and I strike this tuning fork, and I bring it close to this other tuning fork will start to vibrate because of entrainment, because the energy waves that are flowing hit this other device, and because it's in resonance, it can actually gather that energy, and it can store it and start to vibrate on its own. So that's what we mean by resonance. So entrainment is that mechanism. Another really great example, I won't have time to go over completely, is metronome synchronizing. That's a really good example because when you take metronome synchronizing, they're all ticking at different rates, different beats per minute. But then you put them on a surface that allows their motion to transfer onto the surface. And then in the beginning, they're kind of still all ticking at weird frequencies. They're ticking at different beats with each other. But then what happens when you put them on that surface that allows them to rock with each other is now they're communicating. They're working out their differences. They're getting on the same page. They're talking about controversial issues. And then once all of the metronomes have finished working out all their differences and they have agreement, they get on the same page, then they can all start to harmonize and sync up with each other. And that's when they have that synchronizing event. So in societies, that's exactly what we do. When we bravely speak the truth to each other with compassion and tact, when we're willing to be open-minded and humble ourselves to learn and grow beyond what we think we believe and to know to be true, then we can expand our understanding. We gain wisdom from others. We share that wisdom and knowledge with other people. And now we can work together as a single unit to go do something effective in the world, like create a golden age society. I'm just going to take a pause for a moment because I see we got a question here. Let me just check the time. Okay, so we have a question, and the question is our EM field a torus as well? If so, what are the energetic implications of that? The answer to that question is yes. Our bioelectric field is a torus, so it is a toroidal shape. And that toroidal shape is also the same shape that the Earth is in, and the same shape that the Sun is in, and the same shape that the galaxy is in, and arguably the same shape of the universe. So when you have, again, when you have two systems that are made of the same substance or in the same shape, then they're in resonance with each other for the most part. And when two systems are in resonance with each other, then energy and information can be exchanged. I would love to go really deep into this, but I do a series of reports on my website, Silmans in the Storm. They're called Global Mind Energy Reports. And in that report, I have at the bottom section, I break down how your mind and consciousness through your body is literally connected to the geomagnetic field of the Earth. And depending on what's happening in the geomagnetic field, it'll either increase your ability to receive telepathic downloads or it'll decrease that ability. So if you want to look more into that, I would suggest looking on that report. So lastly with this slide, so when we synchronize our brain and heart, what that does is that it creates an extreme amount of coherence. And in that coherence, when we talk about coherence, we're talking about how well things work together. So if things are really low in coherence, if your brain and heart aren't working together, then you have low coherence. If your brain and heart are working really well together, you have high coherence. Now what's interesting, and this is coming from the work of Dan Winter, he developed something called the heart tuner, and he was able to measure with an EKG, electrocardiogram, and an EEG, electroencephalogram, these two waveforms that were coming from the brain and heart. And what he noticed was that when people were in states of bliss, when people are very open and receptive to the truth and in this kind of state where they're absorbing the information and it's organizing beautifully in their mind in this wonderful way, then their brain and heart are really harmonized. They're at high levels of synchronization. When people are out and they're being triggered and they're not necessarily working with, they're having some type of emotional disturbance, something like that, they tend to be closed-minded and their brain and heart are not in harmony. So there's the definitive, we can measure this medically. This isn't just like woo-woo stuff that has no application in reality. We can actually use existing science to validate and support a lot of the things I'm presenting here. Okay. All right, I answered that one. All right, so let's keep going here. So, and feel free if you guys have any more questions, please put them in the chat. I'll try to address them in a timely fashion here. And by the way, at the end of this free energy section, which is going to probably be in about 10, 15 minutes or so, we're going to take a very short break, and then we'll come back to continue on. So let's summarize some of these things here. So energy has structure and directional flow guided by a field. Structure is information. Structure determines the resonant frequency of an energy system, which can be tuned to the environment that collects it for use. So again, the physical property, what the substance is, and how it's laid out, the spatial relationships, the geometry, the structure it has, that determine its resonance. Just to really solidify this point, excuse me, one of a really good proof for this is an organ. What makes all the different frequencies of an organ, like a church organ? Well, it's because those are pipes. So the pipes, the length of the pipe and the width of the circumference of the pipe determine its frequency. So all those different pipes you see here, the reason why the frequency itself changes is because they have different sizes of pipes. So that really solidifies, hopefully, that frequency is directly tied to physical shape and geometry. It's really important to understand. So when we talk about raising our frequency, you might say, well, what do you mean, Justin? Does your body change? Well, yes, to a certain extent, but we're talking about changing the spatial relationships of our energy system, our heart, and our brain by being open and being receptive to the truth, by being humble, by developing open-mindedness, things like this. That's what changes our electromagnetic field and makes us resonant with the universe itself so we can access the Akashic. So over-unity devices produce more energy than they consume. Constructive wave interference allows energy and information to add together. Fractal fields produced by implosive devices, constructive addition of energy vectors, cause coherent organization of incoming energy, leading to the over-unity output. So in other words, a fractal field is the main engine that drives the gathering of energies to produce for an over-unity output, so more energy out than is coming in. So coherence of a field determines how much energy and information it can store. So again, coherence refers to how well do the parts work together, or if we were to use a musical analogy, how well are the musicians all playing together and in tune with each other. If they're really in tune with each other, then the value of coherence is really high, which means that the expression that they can give is really high. So that's kind of an analogy for capacitance there. But in a free energy device, capacitance refers to how much can be stored in the fractal field. So a device that is resonant with the cosmos, so the golden mean Planck frequency, accumulates free energy in the vacuum. So in other words, a device accumulates or gathers up this energy in the vacuum, as we've been referring to. And a perfect explosion results in a perfect implosion from the device results in a perfect explosion, highly structured energy output. So spoiler, consciousness in consciousness, a perfect compression of information, so the ability to learn and then organize the information you're learning, creates perfect knowledge. That leads to perfect behavior, which is sovereignty, harmlessness, abundance, and that leads to perfect behavior, which is sovereignty, harmlessness, abundance, enlightenment, things like this, which is a 40-day period of time that begins on March 19th and ends on Walpurgisnacht, which is May 1st. And I'm going to be producing an article. I post it every year, usually a couple days before March 19th. This year should be really interesting because there's a lot of seeming infighting happening between the Alliance and the Deep State. So I'm not really sure what this year's season of Sacrifice is going to have in store for us, but I have no doubt it should be quite interesting. So keep your eye out for that one. All right. Well, hopefully everybody's back. So now we're going to go get into the self-mastery and over-unity consciousness portion of this. So in this section, we're going to take all the same basic principles that we use to understand free energy devices, and now we're going to use them to understand consciousness. And using the same method that I used before, we're going to take these ideas and these concepts that we've heard of probably a lot, especially in consciousness, and I'm going to define them from an essence perspective. We're going to get a really good foundation. So what I would like you to do for this section is don't necessarily worry too much about the jargon. Just try to absorb the ideas as best you can in your own mind and use that as a lens to look into yourself to see if you can see what I'm describing to you. And in order to do this, we're actually going to break up knowledge that we normally think of as one type of knowledge, and we're going to break it up into several different types that are going to show us how our knowledge and our beingness actually works together to create our identity, to create our consciousness, to create our ego, and how that all relates in terms of evolution and things like this. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so just like before, we're going to go over some of the key principles. I'll just clear my throat there for a second. So what are the key principles? Well, I'm using this in what's called a parody. So I'm going to take the same principles that I outlined above, and now I'm going to describe them exactly in terms of consciousness instead. So earlier we talked about a device. The device draws in energy out of the environment so it can be used for a purpose. Well, your mind body draws information out of the environment so it can be stored in your consciousness and used for a purpose. So when we were talking about free energy devices, we were looking at things from an energy perspective. There was information there, but we tend to use the concept of energy or kind of the perspective of energy to understand how the free energy device works. Well, now we're going to take the other side of the coin. We're going to take information and understand how information is organized and works in order to understand how our consciousness works and how those things relate to the implosive effect of a free energy system and self-mastery. So where does this information come from? Well, the information comes from experience. It supplies the mind body with free information. There's information, the truth is all around us, all over the place. If we tune ourselves to the truth, then we can access that information and use it to organize and develop and master ourselves. So what is the mechanism that allows us to gain information from the environment? Well, it's our attention. When we focus our attention on something, our mind naturally, our awareness, which is the feminine component of our consciousness, gathers the information in naturally. We just have to sit there and it just absorbs into us. And our free will directs consciousness. So free will is the masculine aspect that directs where we focus our attention so that our awareness, our feminine aspect, can absorb the information. So open-mindedness is the thing that allows us to tune. Remember before we had to tune the free energy device. Well, how did we tune the free energy device? We did that by making sure that it was in resonance with the thing or the source of the energy that we wanted to gather from. In consciousness, we need to tune our minds, and the way we do that is by being open-minded and humble. So we tune our mind to information holistically, allowing information to form accurately in our knowledge, in our mind. So we want to develop true knowledge. So what's the spiritual philosophy? This is the organizing principle. This is like the constructive wave interference. This is like the fractal field. So what this does is it allows the information, the facts and knowledge that we're absorbing throughout life to be organized so that it can make sense to us. Excuse me here. One sec. So what happens when we start to go through this spiritual philosophy? When we start to use spiritual philosophy, we develop more complete and accurate knowledge of the truth, and that leads to what has been called Christ consciousness or sovereign status. So this is a spiritual philosophy. This is like the tool, the master key. This is the hammer and nails, so to speak, that we're going to use to do the actual work that makes our consciousness over unity or imparts enlightenment or self-mastery. There we go. Okay. So active philosophy. We need active philosophy. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of philosophy before. The cabal or the deep state have worked really hard to make sure that you think philosophy is this dull, boring, dry thing that only losers and people who don't want to make money in college pursue. In reality, philosophy is one of the most important things you could ever develop working knowledge of. And in effect, you already are a philosopher. So what philosophy is the ability to explore meanings. Well, everybody explores meanings. I hardly doubt that there's a person, or I highly doubt that there's a person listening to me right now who isn't generating meanings. You're constantly generating meanings. But probably for most of your life, the process that you've used to generate these meanings is somewhat automatic and unconscious. But by using conscious philosophy, by actively thinking, by mastering the skill of philosophy, you are literally giving yourself the tools to master your own beingness, which is the gateway to everything. So I know that I'm kind of making some really grand, absolutist, sweeping statements here, but I fully support them. And I could have a whole presentation on just this whole concept of philosophy itself. But what I'm trying to impart to you here is that the master gateway, the master key, the cornerstone to all evolution, all social work, all understanding, all progress is philosophy, is the ability to contemplate your experience, to generate meanings that allow you to navigate reality, So active philosophy is used to contemplate ideas to form links of knowledge between them. So when you take two facts and you put them on your ideational workbench, the consciousness workbench, to use, so to speak. I'm going to use that term a lot in this section. Then your mind naturally, your philosophic mechanism, naturally starts to form connections in your consciousness. And those connections themselves create new knowledge that then can be compared to make new connections. So it's this feedback effect. It's this over unity effect in consciousness. So philosophy, like I said, it's the engine that fuels everything. It's like the fractal field. You throw that fractal field into that room of confetti I was mentioning earlier, it organizes all that confetti. You take your consciousness, your active consciousness, your active truth seeking, and you go out into the world and you gather information. That's when you use that active philosophy to generate accurate knowledge, true knowledge, and spiritual advancement. So holistic contemplation. What we mean by holistic contemplation is that when we learn something new, we need to take that thing that we just learned and we need to compare it to everything else that we've learned in the past. That's what I mean by holistic contemplation. And what that does is it naturally purifies or makes our knowledge more complete and perfect. It increases the coherence of our knowledge. So knowledge embedding, this is what the technique for making sure that all of the knowledge that we have can work well together. So in this sense, when we think about pieces of knowledge or ideas, think about them like musicians in an orchestra. We really need to make sure that they can work well together. Obviously, a group of musicians that have never played together before, they might be able to make some good music, but if they practiced for a year together and really perfected their craft with each other, their ability to make really good music is going to be way higher. So the technique that we use to embed our knowledge or make sure that all our knowledge works well with itself to create a lot of connections is what's called an epistemic regress. So you actually ask how and why things are connected to each other. And what that does is it generates what's called abstract knowledge. And we're going to go into all of this in great detail, so don't necessarily feel like you have to memorize this stuff right now. So abstract knowledge generation is the natural effect of generating more abstract knowledge connections through contemplation. So the more you think about your knowledge and the information you're gathering, the more connections naturally form in your mind. And those connections are what's called abstract knowledge. Specific knowledge is something like a specific thing, like you're sitting in your house right now. That's a specific place in time. Abstract knowledge is the concept of a house in general. That abstract concept of a house not only includes your house, but also includes my house. It includes the White House. It includes all the different houses that you can think of, including ones not on Earth. So that's, and again, we're going to describe what abstract knowledge is here in detail. Epiphanies and awakening, the generation of new insights via contemplation. So when you think about things and you allow yourself to contemplate what they mean, then you naturally have an epiphany and awakening. And that what's basically happening is that two pieces of knowledge that weren't talking to each other, maybe they were even fighting each other in your mind, now there's a connection that forms between them, and now they can work with each other. When you experience two pieces of knowledge working together for the first time, that feels like an epiphany. It feels like an awakening, and your body's literally designed to feed you reward chemicals. So it literally is designed to make you feel good. So self-mastery premises. So in order to understand self-mastery, we have to understand the context of who you are in relation to all that is. So this is I'm going to kind of do this in a quick and dirty fashion to understand this. I gave a presentation last year at Contact in the Desert called Blueprint for a Better World Through Understanding ET Contact and Culture. I go over this in much greater detail, and I also go over the social components of how do we actually create a golden age society and what the extraterrestrials really trying to tell us and a lot of these messages we receive. So if you really want to have a really deep expression of that, you can look at that presentation. However, I'm also going to be re-giving that presentation in much greater detail on this very same network, thanks to Neil Gar, Portal to Ascension. So check that out. That's going to be in May. So let's go over these. So the universe was created for a purpose, and the purpose is to make the creation perfect and harmonious through the participation of the creatures. So just I forgot to mention a little disclaimer, a caveat with this. If this is somewhat new to you, if you're not necessarily a spiritual person, if the idea of God or a creator kind of rubs you the wrong way, I merely ask you to just entertain these ideas, allow these ideas to just express themselves in your mind. You don't have to believe them. Just like a child watching, a story, or when you go to the movies, you don't have to believe everything you see in the movie to allow yourself to experience what the movie's trying to tell you. And in this way, I merely ask you to be open-minded to what I'm saying here, and use this as a guide to understand why self-mastery is the way it is. So again, the universe was created for a purpose. What is the purpose? The purpose is to make the creation perfect through our participation. So we actually get to play a role in making the universe more perfect or perfect. So when we accept the mission of creature perfection, this forms what's called the creator-creature covenant. And this grants us God-given rights. So we were given tools to make the creation perfect. And when I say make the creation perfect, we are a part of that creation. So you might, first things first is a principle you hear a lot in Hermetic philosophy. Before we can make the outside world perfect, we have to make ourselves perfect. So when we accept that mission, we are given rights to do so. So the very fact that you exist in creation means that you already accepted that mission. You already accepted the divine covenant because you have rights. Okay, so the creator or the creature accepts their soul mission by seeking the truth and allowing or aligning with the creator's will. So in other words, you were given rights. And by virtue of the fact that you exist, you've already accepted the mission pre-incarnatively, so when you're from a soul perspective. But when you're in the creation, you have to rediscover what your purpose is. And you do that through seeking the truth. And then eventually you come to realize that there is an actual purpose to existence. And you got to get yourself together. You got to get your house in order and align your will to the creator's will. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that process works. So true seeking provides the raw material for mastery. So again, just like in a free energy device, where does this free energy come from? It comes from the environment. How do we gather the information or the energy in the environment? We do so through the fractal field. In consciousness, the way that we gather the information is attention, right? You have to put your attention on things. You have to put your attention on things you don't understand, you don't know. You have to face the unknown. You have to enter the void the blackness of the void. So he was a hero's journey archetype. You have to go into the abyss. And then when you go into the abyss, you come out with the golden fleece. You face the dragon, you face the unknown, you learn something, you grow internally, and now you can come back and use that knowledge to do something. So that's what true seeking is all about. So knowledge of the law and the creator guide the mind towards the formation of accurate and true knowledge. So when we think about what is the kind of the guide that we use to go through this process of self-mastery, it's the law and knowledge of the creator. So the source of perfection, the source of us, of everything, is the creator. So by seeking for the creator and trying to align ourselves with the creator's will, which the law, cosmic law, is the creator's will, then you align yourself to the path, you work with the creation, and then you start to propel your evolution forward in great detail. So that also allows you to develop true knowledge. So the creator and the knowledge of the law act as a guide, a kind of like a check and balance system to make sure that your knowledge is accurate. So true knowledge and spiritual values are needed by the individual to carry out their soul mission. Over unity consciousness develops in those who wholeheartedly commit themselves to find the creator, the source of truth, and be like them to embody mastery and perfection in their lives. Now, again, if you're hearing this and you're like, man, this sounds really like religious, Justin, what's going on here? You know, I don't jive with this. Simply just try to entertain these thoughts and just think about it for a second. If there is a creator where everything came from, including us, including the blueprint for that makes us who we are and where we're headed, then by seeking for the creator, you not only seek for the master key that gives you the tools you need to understand your purpose in life and master yourself, you also gain the information and the ordering principles you need to do everything else. And that's the source, that is the truth. So seeking the truth, eventually will find the creator. Seeking for the creator is the process of using the truth to find the creator. So self-mastery eventually results in true sovereignty, a wise and competent service to others aligned individual. Now, when I say true sovereignty here, I want to define this properly because there's a lot of different versions of sovereignty out there, obviously. So when I say true sovereignty, I mean an individual who has gained enough understanding of their true nature so that they become creator-like and they act like the creator on the earth. They act selflessly. They serve others. They commit themselves to take on the responsibilities and the burdens of the world. They become the savior of the world. And in a lawful sense, a true sovereign is one who takes a vow of poverty. And when I say a vow of poverty, I don't necessarily mean that you can't use your own abundance. What I mean is that you're not hoarding. You're not selfishly gathering up things around you to then hoard so that other people don't have them. So a true sovereign is not somebody who's accumulating so much wealth that it actually hurts other people. So think about that in terms of like the Queen of England or some of these other alleged sovereigns. Are they really sovereigns? Are they really saviors of the world? Are they really dedicating themselves to be an expression of the divine creator here on earth? And I'll let you think about that one. So spoiler alert. So service to others, mastery, guided by moral law, manifests social harmony and material abundance. So social or cultural over unity. So when the individual does the mastery work in themselves and they guide themselves through moral and universal law to gain this mastery, then they become an engine for abundance in society. They become a component in the societal free energy device that makes abundance and prosperity for all. Okay, so now we're going to get into the really deep essence. This is where I love to live. I love to study the essence of things and really get to a foundation of what something is. So we're going to go through this here now. So truth and mastery. Mastery is defined as a comprehensive knowledge or skill in a subject or accomplishment. In order to gain mastery of something, you need true knowledge of it. You need to open yourself up to it. You can't master something that you're not open to exploring and understanding. So exposing yourself to the truth automatically generates knowledge. That doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect knowledge, but you're going to accumulate some knowledge. And as a matter of fact, at first, one of the great, I would say, good things to keep in mind when you're starting a quest of self-mastery is realize you're not going to be perfect at first. yeah, there's some people who like, maybe if you're lucky, you're like a Jesus type of person, or maybe, it's really Leonardo da Vinci, or some of these people who just so happen to like be really good at things they try the first time. Most people aren't that way. So manage your expectations. Be like, you know what, as long as I try, as long as I make the effort, that's what's important. And then as long as you keep persistently making the effort to perfect your knowledge and perfect your skills, then you will gain that mastery over time. So don't measure your progress by looking around you to see where other people are at. Measure your progress by what are you doing to invest yourself in your own mastery work. So what is some limitations of knowledge? We're going to actually describe and define knowledge in depth here, but one of the things we need to understand is what the relationship between knowledge and the truth is. Well, true knowledge is limited because it is a partial or finite representation of the whole infinite truth. So for example, your memory of a sunset is only a partial story of the whole event. It's only one slice. A really good example of this is, let's imagine a whole bunch of people standing in a stadium. Maybe they're watching a baseball game. They're watching a singular event. They're watching the same truth, right? But everybody has a different perspective on that truth. So what that means is that your perspective isn't necessarily wrong, but it's different than the other person's perspective because it is only a little slice of the whole truth, which means that your knowledge is, even though we quest and we seek to know the truth as much as humanly possible, you have to realize that your knowledge is never going to be a perfect reflection of the whole truth because the whole truth is infinite and your mind and your beingness is finite. So this is the essence of knowledge. Now we're going to describe like, well, what is knowledge exactly? Like, what are we talking about here? Well, first, knowledge describes a subject. So when I say knowledge, it's kind of, we're talking about something out there. And we can describe that thing with some relative degree of completeness. And that's what I'm referring to here by subject matter completeness. So because we can't know the truth entirely because it's infinite, we can gain a complete knowledge of a subject, which is kind of like a quanta or a complete bounded piece of knowledge. And that is open and receptive. So in other words, when you take the time to develop a piece of complete knowledge of something, now you can work with it to do something. Like for example, if you want to learn how to play a piece of music, when you learn how to play a piece of music, that once you've gotten that skill enough and you've worked at it long enough, now you have complete knowledge of that, so you can use that knowledge to play the piece of music. And one of the interesting things about true knowledge is that it's open and receptive. It's not like closed off, so where now once you've got that piece of true knowledge, it's like completely hermetically sealed from the environment. No, it has the ability to make connections and tendrils. It's very similar to like, have you ever seen a neuron and a dendrite in brain cell? Brain cell has this nucleus and then it's sending out all these connecting points to the brain cells. Well, true knowledge is the same thing. It has that potential. So additive knowledge and learning. The truth is by nature interconnected, but knowledge only connects in our minds by thinking about it. Knowledge only has meaning in context. Contemplation gives us a fact in your mind, more context via comparison with other facts. So what I mean by context here, this is really important. So what makes a fact useful? If I gave you a fact, if I said 64,000, what does that mean to you? Well, it lacks context, doesn't it? I mean, am I talking about $64,000? Am I talking about 64,000 people? Am I talking about 64,000 webinars? What am I talking about? That the fact has no context. But if I tell you it's $64,000 that I just so happened to find outside before I started this webinar, I'm going to be giving each of you a portion of that. Just kidding, but wouldn't that be nice? Then now it has context, right? It means something. So for us, in order to understand something truly so it can be useful to us, so in order to take a fact that is like outside of us, that somebody told us, it's extrinsic, we kind of have to have faith in it. We have to think about it. We have to discern it. We have to contemplate it. In the act of contemplating it, what we're doing is we're taking all the knowledge that we have in our database and we're forming these connections and we're adding context to that knowledge. So that's what contemplation actually does. And that's what takes two pieces of knowledge and it blends them together to form some new thing, just like a free energy device. Remember the two different waveforms? They were coming together to blend to form something new thing. That's what active philosophy does for you. So over unity knowledge generation, what we're talking about here is we're constantly swimming through information. You know, we learn a lot of facts in school. We can, you know, there's people can go online and you can be an information junkie and you can just like study information till the cows come home. But what makes that information useful? You got to think about it. You have to contemplate it. And what's interesting is that I could give you a basic set of facts, and if you think about them carefully and use a correct thinking process, you could generate more and more and more knowledge from that basic set of facts. So that's what we're talking about. Remember, over unity refers to in a free energy device, that the energy that it takes to run the device is less than what it actually produces. So there's more energy output than there is an input. In consciousness, we have the ability through active philosophy, through contemplation, by thinking carefully about the information we're learning, to generate more knowledge than what we had to begin with. And you can keep doing that. As a matter of fact, most of the knowledge that I've developed in my life comes because I gather a lot of information and I just sit and think with it. And then it naturally creates all this other knowledge. And then I can go out and check and see if, well, am I right? Am I wrong here? And a lot of the great thinkers in the world have the same capacity. And a lot of you have that. You wouldn't be here right now if you didn't have that capacity. So, you know, pat yourself on the back. So truth receptivity, just like a free energy device has to be receptive or open or have the ability to draw energy out of the 0 point through tuning, we are going to tune ourselves to the energy and information in the field of truth, so to speak, so that we can gain more true knowledge. So how do we do that? Well, we can't understand something unless a container for truth exists. So by developing true knowledge via receptivity, so in other words, that we're receptive and open-minded, we create a magnet or an antenna for more truth. So what we're really talking about here is that true knowledge is additive. When you learn a piece of true knowledge, it acts as a gateway. It's not just like this cold, dead fact. If you're really contemplating your knowledge properly and you're using your knowledge properly, then when you understand something, that immediately opens up new possibilities to understand more things. That's kind of what a spiritual awakening is all about. You take all these facts that you've been accumulating for years, and for the first time, maybe you have this moment where you think about them and you're like, holy crap, this is what's happening. And then once that awakening event happens, now that awakening itself forms another tapestry, an encapsulated body of knowledge that acts like a membrane or gateway or antenna for more knowledge. So here, what are some examples of this? Well, before you can learn algebra, you have to learn arithmetic. Before you can understand what a book says, you have to learn how to read. So in this example, what we're talking about here is that the knowledge of learning how to read opens you up to gather more information that is contained in books. And that is true for anything you learn. So this idea that, you know, there's a random useless fact is really not true at all. A fact or a piece of information is only random and useless because you're not thinking about it and contemplating it properly. If you take the time to think about it and contemplate it, even if it's really hokey and you're not good at it at first, eventually you're going to develop that skill and you're going to gain more and more knowledge and information. You're going to perfect your knowledge. So what is false knowledge? Well, false knowledge acts as an antenna for more false knowledge. So in other words, knowledge as itself has the ability to be true or false. And what tends to happen is if we have a lot of false knowledge, then that false knowledge just allows us to accumulate more false knowledge. But the difference between false knowledge and true knowledge is that false knowledge blocks us from receiving more true information. So the more false knowledge you have, the less receptive you can be to the greater truth around you. So think about it. It's like tuning the device. If true knowledge tunes us to be more receptive to the truth, then false knowledge, its opposite, does the reverse. It detunes us. So for example, if you believe the earth is flat, then you'll reject any ideas related to round earth. If you blindly believe that your partner cheated on you, you'll reject proof of their fidelity. So what we're getting at here is that if you're not open-minded and you have a preconceived notion, you already have a belief. If I told you that, or let me rephrase, if you watch the news and you believe that there really are no cures for cancer, but then I come to you and I'm like, hey, there are cures for cancer. If you blindly believe the news, then you will not be able to accept what I'm telling you because you've already got a piece of false knowledge. So in a sense, false knowledge literally acts like a block. It's like something in the way. So in order to move that out of the way, or in order to gain the true knowledge, you have to take that block and you got to remove it. How do we do that? We do it by contemplation, by active philosophy. So receptivity via choice. So in free energy devices, each component has to be tuned to the energy field around it. In consciousness, an open mind and dedication to the truth, humility naturally works out false knowledge. So this is what's called, generally speaking, it's basically called the Socratic method. So Socrates, anytime he developed a conclusion based on what he was reasoning or trying to figure out, he would immediately try to invalidate that conclusion. He'd be like, okay, well, I think this is what's happening, but let me see how many different ways I can be wrong. And what he was doing there is he was opening himself up to the truth. He was trying to be humble because, you know, let's face it, there's a lot of times where we draw a conclusion and the conclusion resonates. It feels good. And sometimes it resonates not because it's true, but because it validates who we think we are. It's an ego validation. And if you're not careful, you'll close yourself off to being wrong because you don't want to be wrong because you're personally invested and you identify with that piece of information. So when you allow yourself to be open and humble, you limit that possibility of developing false knowledge and blocking yourself off to greater truth. Now, again, we're going to describe a little bit more about what knowledge actually is. So consider knowledge as a map. The map represents the territory, but it is not the territory itself. Similarly, your knowledge of reality isn't reality itself, it's a representation. So that's a critical concept to understand. It's so vitally important that you understand your knowledge is not the truth. It is a copy or is a representation of the truth. Okay, and if you look at this picture here on the left-hand side, clearly your map is not the actual territory. But what's really important is that just like a map maker, our attempts to understand the reality and understand the truth are like sketches. This is what I mean by the second portion here. Sketches are placeholders of truth. So as you live life, you sketch things on your map that represent reality. So you're going out, your first attempt to understand something, you're a little kid, you don't need to do too good of a job of understanding the relationships. Maybe you make some bad conclusions and you develop some false knowledge, but hey, you got at least something on the map. And then later, as you start to live your life, you're like, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't really right. Let me erase that part out of my map and let me redraw it because it's a better representation of reality. So when we think about our knowledge, instead of thinking about your knowledge as like, well, I've learned this fact, it's perfect now, I don't ever have to look at it and touch it again. I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. Everything you've ever learned is only itself a reflection. It's only a placeholder. It's only a sketch. And in the quest of the ultimate truth, the eternal adventure of seeking for the whole absolute infinite truth, we're always going to have to constantly refine and improve our knowledge through this active philosophy and contemplation process. So now we're going to take this concept of a map of knowledge, this representation, and we're going to apply it to what I'm calling a grandmaster map. So let's imagine that everything you could ever know or ever gain knowledge of is represented on a grandmaster map. Initially, most of the map is blank. It's like unexplored territory. If anybody's played a video game where there's like a map, think about it like this. The video game creators, they make all of the places that you're going to explore as a character in the game. But when you start the game, the map isn't filled in yet. But it's all there. It's all there in potential. You just have to go out and explore it. Well, our beingness is the same. Everything that we could ever learn is potentialized in our spiritual beingness. And when we go out in the world, we kind of unlock those pieces of the map. So as you live life, you slowly fill in these places in your map. So if we think about it like this, if you take the time as a map maker, and if you try to sketch the biggest picture of the world as you think of, then that big picture version of the world is going to help guide you when you want to go to these little places. So imagine, just to really solidify this, imagine you're in a valley, and there's a mountain, two mountains on either side, and then the valley kind of stretches out into the distance, and there's even a mountain up in the distance where there's a sunset. Well, if you sketch everything that you see in front of you, you see that there's different places. There's like a meadow to the left, there's a whole bunch of trees, there's a little brook to the right, there's even a lake all the way up by that mountain ahead of you. You can sketch all these places on your map, but the sketch is just that. It's a sketch. It's not really detailed. But now you have a good idea. You got a holistic picture of everything in the territory. So now you can go to these places like the meadow. You can go to the mountain on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. You can go to the lake or the river, and you can get a more detailed understanding of that specific area. So this is what I'm referring to as a top-down truth-seeking method. So we can seek the truth by going from the little or the microcosm up, but a better way to do it, I would argue, is to seek from the top down, to try to ask yourself, what is the biggest ideas and concepts and understanding that I could think of? And then using that as the baseline, then I'm going to try to fill in the spaces in between here. So that's what the whole truth is kind of describing for us. Because the whole truth is infinite and it's fractal. Sorry, let me try it again here. So the whole truth is fractal because it is infinite. And therefore, the whole is reflected specifically in the parts, as above, so below. Little truths nest inside bigger truths. So when you take the time to gain the biggest picture of reality, which is a spiritual type of knowledge, when you seek the knowledge about the Creator, when you seek the knowledge about spirituality, we're talking about knowledge that applies everywhere. So it's a grand master map. It's going to give you a big holistic sketch. That is going to act as a guide because of fractality, because the whole is reflected in the parts, because as above, so below. Because if you really do a good job of mapping out that knowledge for yourself as spiritual knowledge, it's going to act as a guide for the knowledge, all the other little pieces of knowledge that are going to fit inside of that. So a creator-creation concept, the very idea of the creator and creation as a whole is a powerful force for organizing the mind for greater truth receptivity. The creator is the blueprint for perfection and order, the perfect fractal, while the creation is the unfolding or manifestation of that blueprint. So what I mean by that is to seek for knowledge of both of these, the creator and the creation, it primes your mind for increased truth receptivity. So in a way, the spirituality, what I'm calling the creator-creation concept, that's like the grand master key. That's like the fractal field in a free energy device that allows every other piece of information you understand and learn to find a place. It's going to naturally gravitate to where it needs to go if you've really developed a living philosophy when it comes to exploring spiritual concepts and realities. So fractal optimization of knowledge. What we're talking about here is, when we talk about optimization, we're talking about organizing. So we're going to talk about using knowledge or using a fractal, the concept of a fractal, self-similarity, as above, so below, the big being reflected in the little, to organize our own knowledge. So spiritual knowledge is the fruit of truth-seeking, wholehearted truth-seeking, acting as a template to describe all things. So again, if you think about the biggest ideas you can possibly think of, the grandest truths, the universal laws, the divine truths, the spiritual laws or truths of existence, then those apply everywhere. So they're true everywhere in reality. Conversely, if you're only trying to define specific truths that, for example, that you're trying to figure out how to bake a perfect chocolate cake, you can get a really good understanding of how to bake that really good perfect chocolate cake, but the knowledge that you get there, those laws are only going to apply to baking a perfect chocolate cake. They're not really going to be too useful when trying to understand how a solar energy emits from the sun and interacts with the geomagnetic field, or various other topics. So when you seek for the truths that describe the whole of reality, which are spiritual truths, which is spiritual knowledge, then it's like a cheat code, to use that term rather liberally. It's like a key or a master organizing tool that's going to help you organize all information. And it provides holistic context. So remember, context is what allows the facts you learn to actually be useful. What spiritual knowledge does is it creates like a map, a grand map. So every time you learn a fact, you're like, oh, I know exactly where to put that fact. It goes here. That fact goes here. That fact goes here. That's what the spiritual knowledge does for you. It acts as a grand organizing principle. I can't overstate that enough. It's so important. So what's a fractal iteration in relation to this? Well, an iteration of a fractal occurs when a formula used to produce it is moved along the numerical series. As the truth emerges into our awareness, it nests inside pre-existing true knowledge, like a fractal integration. So iteration in this sense is new knowledge created by connecting separate facts through a unified model In this case, a spiritual model. So what I'm getting at here is that, again, when you start your initial jaunt into seeking the truth, if you're looking up at the top right of this diagram, the first iteration, it's just a rough sketch. And then as you keep studying more and more, there's more and more detail added. All these new facts start to get placed on this fractal. And then as you go down, it becomes really replete. It becomes highly detailed and organized. So this is what the power of active philosophy with the key or the primer of spirituality in mind. This is why seeking for, there's a phrase, I believe it's in the Bible, I can't remember, but it's something like, to seek for God, you find everything. To find everything, you find God. It's something like that. So this is the power of the spiritual concepts. There we go. Okay. So essentials for self-mastery. One's grand master map of knowledge has to include knowledge of the creator in order, the ordering principles that govern reality, law. So we have to have knowledge of the creator. We have to recognize that there is a creator, because the creator is itself the best explanation to explain all phenomenon. Just take that on faith for a moment. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in detail momentarily. The ordering principles that govern reality, that's law. So you not only need to know that the creator exists in some fashion, you have to know that laws exist, because laws are the rules of the game. So to use a game analogy, to use a video game analogy, in order to progress through a video game, you have to play by the rules. Or if you're not familiar with video games, in order to be a good sports player, in order to be a good baseball player, you have to play by the rules. If you don't play by the rules, well, you might be good at some other thing, but that you're not playing baseball anymore, you're playing something else. So in order for us to play and master the game of life, we have to know what the rules of life are. What are the rules of life? Those are laws. And there's various sets of laws. We got divine laws, we got natural laws, we got something called positive law, we got cognitive laws, so the laws of consciousness. We got sovereign laws, or the laws of how social entities work together. Those are also dealing with moral laws. So when you take the time to understand these things, then it's like you're literally learning how to work inside of the game properly. That's why it seems paradoxical, but when you learn the laws of existence, which are limitations on your free will, you actually enhance your freedom, because now you can express your free will with greater degrees of potency and power. And then the last thing we need to learn, or not the last thing, but the other thing we need to learn, is we need to know knowledge of the self. We need to know how we work, how our psychology works, how our body-mind connection works. How do we store knowledge? How does our mind actually store information? How do we use that knowledge to do something useful? All of that is encapsulated in psychology. So we need knowledge of the creator, we need knowledge of law, which are the rules of life, and we need knowledge of the self, the vehicle that we use to express our mission, to seek perfection. And then lastly, we need a depth skill in philosophy. So we have to become better and better in philosophy, in the contemplation of meanings, the understanding of insights and experiences. So just, again, when I say philosophy here, I'm not saying this really dry, dusty, boring thing. If you've had some cathartic experience, if you're, you just met some beautiful girl and you think she's amazing, and you're having all these feelings and insights, and you're like, why is this happening? What's going on here? What am I trying to understand here? You're using philosophy to do that. That's what philosophy is. Just take a moment to, okay, thought I maybe had a question. And all of that helps you, wait a second here. I gotta go back. There we go. All of that helps you in this mastery process. So self-mastery requirements, I'm gonna list them just again, and it's stated in a different way. You have to seek the truth wholeheartedly with selfless dedication to building true knowledge. What I mean by selfless dedication is when you have a fact, when you learn something that doesn't jive with you, that doesn't resonate with you, you got to be careful. Don't just throw it out because it doesn't resonate. Because in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, the reason it doesn't resonate is because if you allowed yourself to accept the truth, it would change you. And people fear change. In a lot of cases, this is when the ego, to use kind of that aspect of spirituality, this is when the ego blocks us in growth, because we identify these truths, our beliefs help stabilize our beingness. And when the truth comes in, it acts as a chaotic agent. It destabilizes us. If anybody's gone through an awakening experience, you learned some truth that shook you to your foundations, and it felt really weird at first. And you had to allow yourself selflessly to pursue the truth, even though it didn't necessarily jive with you, even though it didn't necessarily agree with your sensibilities and your tastes. So that's really important. If you really want to pursue your mastery, you have to do so selflessly. You have to value the truth and the transformation that comes with it more than whatever type of limited static ego configuration that you want to have. So you have to gain knowledge of the whole of reality, spirituality. You have to comprehend the limits of existence, free will. And you have to understand the self and work with immanence of that. And you have to obviously do this by contemplation and through active philosophy. So the product of all of this, when you actually start to do this consciously and really work at this, you develop what I call a cornerstone of knowledge. And this acts like a sturdy foundation so that everything else that you will ever learn in your life and all future lifetimes is going to rest securely in this foundation. And in a sense, if we really want to get out there as far as like the nature of the soul, I would argue that every lifetime that you're living, what's happening is you're building a new cornerstone of knowledge. And then in between lives, those cornerstones, they synthesize and they grow complete and more stronger. And then in each time you come back in life, you have a stronger spiritual foundation of your beingness. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different types of knowledge. Let me just check the time real quick. Okay, so we're doing quite well here. So now we're going to break down the different types of knowledge. So when knowledge in relation to free energy is effectively, it's like the components. So this is like the raw material that we're going to use to create a self-mastered being. So we need to understand how this material works and these parts work. Just like in a free energy device, we need to understand how these parts work together so that the energy flows come together and can be used properly. Now we're going to understand the different types of knowledge and how all of these things work together in your own consciousness to produce you and how you live life. So the fruit of proper discernment, active philosophy, and open-mindedness is intrinsic knowledge. So when we talk about like what knowledge is better, intrinsic knowledge is the best. That's the gold standard. That's what we want. So intrinsic knowledge is information you understand personally. The basis of your understanding is your working knowledge of the argument and evidence describing a phenomenon. For example, you know how to brush your teeth intrinsically. So what I mean by that is you're the act of brushing your teeth. You know how to do it. You know, you've developed your own system and you're not depending on somebody else. You're not following somebody else's recipe. So it's yours. The skill is yours. So when you have intrinsic knowledge of something, it's yours. It's like owning the knowledge, so to speak. Extrinsic knowledge is kind of the opposite. It's something you only partially understand based on faith in an external source. You might not know what the argument is or if there's any evidence to support the argument, but you believe it anyway. And extrinsic knowledge can block intrinsic knowledge when personal understanding is replaced by dogma or faith in a credible source. Dogma left unchecked works against over-unity consciousness. So the big difference here is that extrinsic knowledge is something that you hear from somebody else. So right now, if you've never heard about any of these concepts that I'm going over before, all of this is extrinsic to you. You just kind of have to absorb it and entertain it, but you don't really understand maybe how it works. But once you sit and contemplate it and you think about how things work on your own, now you take that piece of extrinsic knowledge and you make it intrinsic. You make it your own. Extrinsic knowledge is also somebody else's reasoning. So if I go to you and I say, or we'll use a different example. If you listen to the news and you listen to some of the medical quacks out there, they'll tell you there are no cures for cancer. If you believe them, how do you know that there aren't any cures for cancer? Did they lay out an argument that says, well, here's all the reasons why we know there are no cures for cancer? Did those reasons make sense? Is the presentation of those reasons in that argument accurate? Well, if you just heard the line, there are no cures for cancer, you don't know. You have to have blind faith in what that person is saying. And what's actually happening is if you believe what that other person is saying, then you're taking their mind and you're absorbing it into yours. And effectively what's happening is your thoughts are now being guided by somebody else's reasoning. Doesn't that sound a little bit like mind control? It should, because that's exactly what it is. So when we think about intrinsic and extrinsic knowledge, you got to realize that at first, all knowledge begins as extrinsic, okay? Unless you've internally derived it yourself through your own personal process. which means that it's not that extrinsic knowledge is bad necessarily. It's that it's the first step. It's like the raw material. It's kind of like you bought some stuff from the store. You got to take it out of the package so you can use it properly. And so when you hear a fact, when you hear a presentation, when you hear some piece of knowledge coming from somebody, your job is to think about it. And then in the act of thinking about it, you claim it as your own. And now you develop your own opinion, your own knowledge, your own arguments about it. And it becomes intrinsic instead of extrinsic. So embedding and schema. So how is knowledge actually woven together? Well, since the truth is one, true knowledge is sticky. It tends to stick to other true knowledge. Schemas, this is a psychological term. Schemas are connections that form between two ideas that share common subject matter, scope, and context, resulting in the generation of new knowledge. So for example, your knowledge of the letters of the alphabet slowly form connections that allow you to spell words. So when you think about two ideas that are related in some way, your mind naturally, when I say naturally, I don't mean like, blindly, passively. I mean that when you put these ideas on your consciousness tool bench, so to speak, your mind, and you just sit and observe them, the holistic aspect of your mind, your right brain in particular, the feminine aspect of you, is going to naturally start to form these connections, okay? And that's what schemas are. So embedding in schemas occurs when a fact connects with another, creating a grander piece of knowledge that expands the scope and context. So when two ideas are in resonance with each other, when they have the same subject matter, then they will naturally start to connect with each other when contemplated, producing a grander idea. So this is analogous to, or similar to, constructive wave interference before. So for example, here's an example for you. Fact number one, cancer kills people. Fact number two, cures for cancer exist. Fact number three, the government suppresses cures for cancer. So if you take all three of those ideas, cancer kills people, cures for cancer exist, but the government's suppressing them, then what is some new insight or revelation that could be divined or made contact with in your own mind? Well, I put one here for you, which is that suppressing cures for cancer is intentional. They must be doing it on purpose. And part of this nefarious purpose is to cull the population or do population control. And that's just one conclusion you can draw. So the point is that the way that we start to connect our knowledge and our facts is by putting them on the ideational tool bench or our consciousness tool bench. We put these facts on the table and we allow our natural ability to form connections to express themselves. Really, it's beautiful. It's so simple. All you have to do is just allow yourself to think freely, just like a child explores the world, and your mind is naturally going to form connections. Okay, so here are some more knowledge types. We just described intrinsic and extrinsic knowledge. We described how pieces of knowledge can weave together to form new pieces of knowledge. So now we're going to talk about specific versus abstract knowledge. So specific ideas are things like a car, a newspaper, your memories, and so on. The scope and context of the idea is limited and highly specific. So for example, your memory of dinner only applies to a specific time and location and space, describing object relationships in that space and time. So for example, what specific knowledge is a specific thing. So here, this phone, that's my phone. This phone is my phone. There's only one phone like it, and it's mine. And that's a specific type of phone. Or let's even use maybe a little better analogy to make it really clear for you. If I was to ask everybody to draw a picture of themselves on a piece of paper, that picture would contain elements that are only about you. That picture only describes you. It's specific, which means that that picture only represents you. It doesn't represent somebody else, it represents you. It kind of sounds, again, when we talk about these things, we're talking about things we've used a whole bunch of times, but I'm asking you to think about them in greater detail because it's going to allow you to organize your own consciousness and understand how these components work together. So we have specific ideas, which I just mentioned, and then we have something called abstract ideas. These are non-specific and intangible by nature. They can incorporate multiple specific ideas at once. They explain whole sets of specific ideas related by subject. So for example, earlier I said that this phone is mine. There's only one phone like it, and it is mine, okay? It has my information, it has my pictures on it, it has my notes, it has my voice memos, my apps, all these things like this. You might have a phone that's like it, but it is not my phone. So this is a specific idea. But then if I wanted to say, well, what about phones in general? Phones in general incorporate this phone, right? Because this is a phone, isn't it? But now when I say phones in general, I'm also describing your phone, and I'm describing even the phones from like the mid-90s, those big hunky brick ones that you could probably use to kill somebody if you wanted to. That's also a type of phone. So when we talk about abstract ideas are like the container that can hold or describe specific ideas, okay? So metaconcepts are highly abstract ideas that describe a set of specific ideas in one concept. So a person is a specific example of a human being. So I am me. I am a specific example of a human being, Justin Deschamps. You, I don't know who you are, but you are a specific person. There's nobody like you. There's only one person of you. But what if we wanted to come up with an idea that encapsulated or incorporated not only me, but you and everybody else? Well, we could describe a human being. So when we say the concept of a human being, it's a categorization that describes not only me and you, but also describes every other human being that exists out there. So here in this image we see on the left-hand side, we have two pictures. On the top, we have an actual hand, somebody's physical hand. That hand has details. It's highly specific. It's highly refined. There's fingerprints on it. So if, if we were to zoom into that photograph, we could see that those fingerprints are there, and those fingerprints only correspond to one hand. There's only one hand like that hand up in the top image. But what if we wanted to create a picture that represents all possible hands, well, specifically right hands in this example? Well, we can do that. That's called an icon. An icon, or a thumbnail in a computer technology, or technology terms, is something that represents a whole set of ideas. That is a meta concept. So what the term meta refers to something that is enclosed or around or surrounding something. So the concept, this image of a hand, the sketch of a hand, it is true or applies to all hands that fit that description. As long as it's a right hand, as long as it has 5 fingers, that icon or that image, that abstract concept of a hand incorporates all other specific hands. And what we're talking about here, which hopefully you might be grasping on your own, is that an abstract is the macrocosm where the specific is the microcosm. The microcosm fits inside the macrocosm. And is it very similar to a fractal? The specific hand looks like the bigger concept of a meta hand. So when we talk about specific and abstract, we're literally describing in consciousness the way ideas are organized in terms of fractals. As above, so below, self-similarity. So the generation of abstractions. So how do we actually produce abstractions, and why are they useful? Well, let's get into this here. So abstract ideas are extremely useful and a necessary aspect of life. As a matter of fact, most of the knowledge that you have is not specific. So when you think about useful knowledge, especially things that you describe and talk about with other people, you're describing abstractions. You might say, oh, I really like pizza. Well, you're not describing one experience where you ate pizza. You're describing the whole set of experiences that led you to a conclusion that says, I like pizza. That is an abstract description. That's an abstract statement. So specific knowledge contemplated and analyzed generates abstractions or metaconcepts of the specific idea contemplated. So for example, if you contemplate the scenario of 2 men arguing, that generates the abstract concept of a disagreement. To use another example, if I asked you to think about all of the various men, or kind of gave you the answer there beforehand. So if I asked you to think about all of the different people that exist on the planet, and I asked you to tell me what are the 2 ways that we can categorize all the different people, I'm basically asking you to take this specific set, right? And I ask you to generate some abstract concept that describes the differences in this set of people. Well, we have that. That's men and women. I can take the whole population of humanity, which are these specific instances, right? I'm a human being. All of you are human beings. And we ask ourselves a question, well, what are ways that we can categorize these groups of people? We can do so using the category of male and women. Some people have these certain physical characteristics that we're calling male, and some people have these certain physical characteristics that we're calling female. So we just created 2 abstractions, all right? Well, guess what? We can keep going further. Now, what if I ask you, okay, so now you've created these two categories. What statement or how can you describe the category that incorporates both men and women? Well, that's the concept of a human being. That's what categorizes those two things together. So again, we're talking about how your mind and consciousness is naturally capable of creating fractals or embedded natures or harmonizing itself in terms of this holistic framework. So specific to abstract tendency, the more one contemplates ideas to explore meanings, uses philosophy, the more abstract knowledge is generated. Abstract ideas can themselves be contemplated to form more abstract concepts. All specific knowledge generate abstract knowledge via contemplation over time. So the reason it's important to understand knowledge generation through abstraction is that the aspect of contemplating knowledge is going to form these connections or facts. Let me start again. The ability to contemplate specific facts, to contemplate your experience, is going to generate knowledge that is abstract, and that abstract knowledge is going to have the power to describe multiple things in reality. And the more and more you do that, you're literally going to have the power to predict reality. So when you develop your knowledge enough, you can actually start to predict events in reality based off of how well you've distilled the key principles and information. Okay, so here we have the concept of a Gestalt. I'll just go over this very briefly. A Gestalt is a psychological term that refers to basically this specific to abstract encapsulation. It's very similar to like a Russian doll. And what it basically is fractal consciousness. So gestalts are organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. Your memory of a dinner last night is itself a singular idea made of a tapestry of other ideas blended together. So your consciousness organizes itself in fractal groupings. One idea nested inside another is a gestalt. So this is the way your consciousness works. It's designed to work in that way. And as we see here on the left-hand side, we have 4 different representations of a gestalt. I'll focus on this one down the bottom left. We have these dots, and they have these little chunks cut out of each of the dot. Well, if you just take the dots randomly and you were to strewn them everywhere, it wouldn't really make much sense. But because they can be put in a certain configuration, these specific dots can create or formulate a new holistic idea, which is this cube that we're looking at here. So the gestalts and abstract ideas are related in that an abstract framework organizes specific ideas as a whole, a gestalt. So your judgment that an experience was good or bad is an abstract container for a specific set of experiences. So identity and goals. So now that we've covered what consciousness is, or I'm sorry, knowledge, now that we've described what knowledge is, that's specific and abstract knowledge, we have extrinsic knowledge that kind of hangs out on the outside when we're first learning something new, and as we contemplate it, it becomes intrinsic and starts to move in towards us. As this inward flow starts to happen, at the center of this inward flow of our beingness, we have our identity, the knowledge and information that makes up who we think we are. So now we're going to describe how this works. So when you formulate a goal, you also create an identity or a character frame, a characterological structure, to use a fancy term, so that you can express the idea. So if you think about, imagine any goal that you might have. Let's say you wanted to cook dinner for some friends. Who are you in that imaginative scenario? Are you happy? Are you pissed off? Are you irritated that you have to cook for your friends? Are you overjoyed because you have the experience? Well, you might not think about it this way, but every time you formulate a goal, you simultaneously formulate an identity or an ego role to express that goal. So ego roles are specific, like driving a car. So right now I'm in the ego role of, talking. So I'm in the mental configuration of using my mind and my voice to speak and communicate ideas. Okay, so that's something specific. When I'm done this, let's say I'm going to go eat dinner, then I'm going to be in a different role. I'm going to be in the ego role of consuming food. Okay, so ego roles are specific. A maxim are general rule sets that describe the whole set of who we think we are. So maxim are abstract statements that describe general rules. Personal laws, these are the rules that describe how you will act in some situation. They form the abstract framework of your total identity. So for example, when you say, I am a loving person, that describes who you are in relation to other people. It's abstract, it's general. When you say I'm a loving person, you're not saying I love that person or I don't love that person. You're saying I generally love all people. So we're talking about, see how it's an abstract general rule that applies everywhere versus the specific ego rule that applies only in a specific situation. So identity is the character role we need to invoke to do something, as well as our abstract personal maxims. So identity is both of these things. So identity works in an individual frame when you're focusing on a goal, but it also works holistically and in real time, in life, both things are operating. That's why anytime you have an emotional reaction to something, the emotional reaction is specific for the moment, but it also reaches back into the past, and it also has this whole archetypal aspect to it. There's a whole discussion we could have at another time. So when you set a goal, you form an ego identity to express it. Identity is dynamic. So what I mean by dynamic is it's fluid, it's changing. Your sense of self is constantly growing and evolving because you invest yourself in new goals and gain experience. Every time you invest yourself in something new, every time you pursue something wholeheartedly, it's like you're transforming yourself. You're literally going through the act of doing a personal transformation event in whatever way that you express that goal. That's why it's good to understand the attitude that you bring into your goals that you're expressing. That what is your character structure? Who are you in this goal? Are you a hateful, nasty, bitter person because you just can't stand cooking for people and you're wondering why the hell you got to deal with it? Well, what is that going to do? If you have that attitude when you express the goal, then that identity is going to entrench itself in your beingness. Okay, it's going to be recorded in your mind body. So personality integrity. The less conscious you are of yourself, particularly the maxims that you use to organize your personality, the more likely you will suffer cognitive dissonance and other mental disturbances. So this really what I'm getting at here is it's very important to understand yourself and seek self-knowledge. So purifying knowledge, this is really important. When we want to make sure that we're increasing the coherence of our knowledge. Remember, coherence refers to how well something works together with other things. In free energy devices, the more coherent the device, the more energy it can store, the more energy it produces, the better the device. So in beingness and consciousness, the better our knowledge works together, the more it's integrated, the more holistic it is, the more useful it's going to be, the more wise we are, the more we can do and be empowered in the world. So it needs to be purified. Active philosophy or contemplation is the key to purification. New knowledge needs to be compared with old knowledge so it can be linked and any errors can be addressed. This gives a new fact context within your existing knowledge base. So when we purify knowledge, this enhances over unity consciousness. You gain more wisdom from less knowledge. So the more you develop the skill to think and critically think carefully using your active philosophy skills, the more you can perfect the knowledge you have, the more wise you become, the more useful this knowledge is to you. So purification is the act of making sure all your knowledge agrees with itself. So in philosophy, there's a branch of philosophy called Epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. And this is basically the master keys to understand how to discern something properly. So it's used to discern and understand what something means. The creator-creation concept as a guide, the creator-creation concept acts as a guide to ensure purified knowledge harmonizes with the source of truth, the creator. So you might say a cheat code, if you like that term, or a mind hack, or a key or a cornerstone of gaining spiritual enlightenment or really propelling your evolution forward is to have this concept of the creator, because it's really going to help you purify your knowledge. So implosion being abstraction. What I mean by that is as one contemplates experience, new ideas flow towards the center of consciousness, becoming part of your identity as abstract connections form. So that's what's happening. This is the implosive effect of your knowledge. As you contemplate things, schemas get formed. You start to form like really abstract rules and principles and understanding things about life. And then those rules and principles and understandings about life literally start to shape your identity. Epistemic regress exercise. This is a technique that we can use to purify our knowledge. So this is the act of asking questions about why something is true and what evidence exists to support it. So this exercise creates schemas or connections across the whole chain of ideas explored. It helps identify errors, false knowledge, and builds interconnecting abstractions. So It sounds like a really fancy term, it kind of is, but basically what epistemic regress simply means is that if you tell me some fact, I ask you, why is that true? What evidence is there to support it? Then you give me an answer. You say, oh, well, this is the evidence to support it. So for example, I might say, well, it's a cloudy day outside. And you say, well, how do you know it's a cloudy day outside? And I say, well, because I'm sitting in this room looking outside of the window right now, and I can see that it's overcast. And that experience of looking out to see that it's overcast congrues or agrees with all these other past experiences I've had that I know it's overcast. And then you can keep asking a question again, like, well, how do you know that those past experiences were? And in the process of doing so, it's going to kind of force you to think about things you take for granted, right? So a lot of times, and this is rife all over the place in almost every field of academia you can imagine, they lack a lot of epistemological skill sets. So their conclusions are kind of resting on a hazy foundation. And most, the cabal or the deep state, they don't want us to have a solid foundation in our truth, because if we did, it would become really useful knowledge. So this epistemic regress exercise is really helpful. I'm actually going to skip this example because we're running a little short on time. Okay, so now that we've described all these components, I talked about intrinsic and extrinsic knowledge. We've talked about specific knowledge and how that tends to become more abstract as we contemplate it. And we've also discussed how abstract knowledge starts to form the basis of your identity and who you think you are. Now we're going to take all of those things that we just described, and we're going to put them on a model or a map to understand how this works in an implosive fashion. So this is what I call this counterpunctal model of consciousness. And I specifically chose this color scheme for a reason. So outside we have the void, the blackness, the unknown. On the outer edge is the white boundary. This is your conscious mind, your attention. So, in Hermetic philosophy and a lot of other different schools of thought, the void is the unknown. The light of awareness is the consciousness. That's how we gather information. So new ideas and new information passes through this boundary. Specific ideas, which is the red, they hang out on the outside. So there's a lot of specific ideas out here. Look at the surface area. There's a lot of surface area. Now, as you contemplate a specific idea, they start to form connections. And the subconscious mind naturally starts to produce these connections. And that new specific connection, that abstraction, starts to move towards the center. So for example, you might have, let's say, 50 different experiences of you eating pizza. Well, when you come to the conclusion that you really like pizza, that you say, I love pizza. Well, now that idea, that abstraction comes and sits on the orange layer. Now the yellow layer is what I'm calling the abstract unity layer. So eventually, as you start to form these abstractions, you start to contemplate your ideas more and more, they're going to start to form grander and grander rule sets, grander and grander descriptions of reality. And eventually, they're going to start to kind of rub up against each other. And they have to start to agree with each other. So if you believe the world is a beautiful, amazing place, but then when you go to work, you believe the world is a cruel and horrible place, well, those are two conflicting ideas. Those are two conflicting worldview abstractions. And they're going to create some cognitive dissonance in you. So, and they're also going to create some identity issues. So anything beyond this layer is going to start to influence your identity. So anything that is abstract, that hasn't been contemplated perfectly so that it can form a grander rule set, a grander abstraction, a grander truth, is going to kind of hang out outside of the identity layer. It's going to act like something annoying. It's going to act like a disturbance in your energy field. It's like it's called the conceptual controversy. So in other words, you're conflicted. And because you're conflicted, you're having issues, you've got some conflict. One of the things that happens when people experience a lot of trauma is they make contact with malevolence. And psychologically, when somebody makes contact with malevolence, that disturbs them because the rules that they were using to govern their reality break down. So decent example of this, let's say you were raised in a house where your mother and father told you that you can always trust people and that people always have your best interest in heart. And you never have to worry about people deceiving you or lying to you or things like this. Well, that can maybe be true while you're living with your family, because you might have a family that can actually honor that. But what happens when you leave your family and your house? You're going to probably have an experience where you do get deceived. Somebody does take advantage of you. And now that's going to shake you to your foundations. That single event is going to cause a lot of disturbance. And you have to sit and process that and think about that. And when you think and process that, then that's going to update your worldviews. It's going to update your view of reality so that you have a better map of reality to navigate through life. So moving from the yellow layer, if we move into the green layer, this is the worldview cosmic belief layer. So the reason why this influences your identity is how you think of the world and the cosmos and the grand the understandings that you have about existence itself. Because you are related to existence, they determine partially your identity. So for example, if you're a nihilist, if you're a material nihilist, a nihilist is somebody who believes in nothing. They believe that the universe is ultimately meaningless. If you're a materialist, then you believe that there's no such thing other than material reality. So when you are a materialist, a material nihilist, what tends to happen is you tend to have a really nasty outlook on life. Life seems meaningless. It seems purposeless. So then what do you think you are in relation to this purposeless, meaningless existence? It literally changes your identity. It changes who you think you are, because your worldview augments what you think you are capable of doing. And because of that, it augments what you think your identity actually is. Conversely, if you believe that the universe is a beautiful place created by an infinitely perfect creator for us to participate in the adventure of making the creation perfect, then it changes your identity, doesn't it? It changes what you think is possible about yourself, and therefore changes your image of self and your persona. So really, if you want to understand how you believe, why you act the way you are, why your sense of self is the way it is, think about your worldview. Think about your cosmic beliefs. What do you believe about reality? And this is one of the reasons why the Cabal have spent so much time and energy devaluing the divine. They want you to think that the creator is this nasty, petulant child in the sky that hates you and thinks you've originally sinned against it and has cast you into this affective purgatory that we call Earth, where you suffer and toil, and maybe if you're lucky and if you really do some sacrifices and eat plenty of pieces of stale bread, that maybe you can gain salvation. So they've engineered a false version of the cosmos so that it'll change who you think you are so that you're more easily controlled. On the blue layer, we have identity and maxims. So again, the interface between the worldview and the identity layer creates that maxim structure. Hold on one second. Oh, it looks like I got a whole bunch of things in chat happening. Let me just take a second here to look through this. Nope, this is not us. Okay, everything is translinear. Okay, it looks like there's no question. I just want to make sure there's no questions here. No questions. Oh, we do have one question. What is the branch of philosophy called? Okay, so somebody just asked, what is the branch of philosophy called that I've been referring to? It's called epistemology. Epistemology, I'll actually type that in the chat now. Epistemology. That's the branch of philosophy. There's a really good book. I'll actually link it in the chat at the end of our talk here. That is a really good overview of epistemology. Okay, so moving on. Lastly, we have the creator self layer. Now this is what's really interesting. So in the blue layer, this is basically your persona, your ego, who you think you are. Now that changes. So if you grow, if you have a spiritual awakening, this part of you changes fundamentally because your knowledge on the other layers above it has also changed. So hopefully it's impressing upon you that all of this stuff works together. All of your knowledge, as it becomes more abstract, starts to inform who you think you are. And when you have a spiritual awakening, when you have a paradigm shift, what's happened is that you've contemplated these knowledge and you've generated abstractions to such an extent that it literally starts to change your relationship to the cosmos itself. Now all that change and that flowing, that evolution happens in the blue layer right there. Now what's interesting is that the purple layer stays the same. It does not change ever. And that's because that's the God fragment. That's the still point of awareness. So you have this still point of awareness and you have this free will. Those two things work together. They change the things on the outside, but the center point stays the same. It stays crystal. It stays lighted. So, so this is the center point of model for consciousness. So hopefully it'll impress upon your mind that things flow from the outside in. And if it doesn't, you're going to look for this right now. So specific ideas flow inside as we contemplate them. Remember, the engine, the mechanism that fuels this self-mastery process is active philosophy and contemplation. So abstract implosion, again, as you start to think about specific knowledge, these things implode. So now I'm making the connection to the free energy device, as the fractal field starts to work its magic, as these energy directions start to get tuned and bent so that they can point in the right direction, as they go into phase conjugation, so their waveforms can align with each other, that creates the implosive effect. In consciousness, as you think about your ideas, as you think about your truths, as you ask yourselves the questions of why is this true and how does this connect with other knowledge, you naturally start to form abstractions, and those abstractions move into the center. A paradigm shift occurs when the information that exists outside of those identity layers, so remember the abstract layer, it's kind of hard to see now because I changed the colors, but everything outside of the blue in this diagram on the right-hand side represents the knowledge that we have, right? Specific knowledge, and then some abstractions that have been created. And then eventually those abstractions butt up against each other, and they have to link up in order for them to go inside the worldview and cosmic view layer. Well, what happens is when you start to do a lot of contemplating and your knowledge outside of that in the red layer changes, then that starts to change your worldview and your inside world. This is what a spiritual awakening is. So I'll put myself on the table here, or in the spotlight. When I was an atheist for most of my life. When I had my awakening in 2010, it was because I discovered cures for cancer through the Gerson miracle, particularly the Gerson miracle movie. I read the book, The Gerson Therapy, and I was really trying to debunk it, and I couldn't debunk it. I could not prove it wrong, and I actually ended up proving it to myself. And once I did that, so I proved that that's a specific knowledge was true, then I engaged in an active philosophy process. And I said, well, wait a minute, if this specific piece of knowledge is true, what does that say about everything else that I've learned in my life? Well, the conclusion I drew was basically, well, Jesus, if they're lying about cures for cancer, have I been lied to about that? What the heck else have I been lied to about it? I have to question everything. And then I started that process of questioning everything. And eventually I realized that my belief that the universe was not intelligent, or my belief in atheism started to dematerialize. It no longer had any substantive support. And then that caused a radical reorganization of my beingness. Now, what's interesting is that most spiritual awakening does not feel good at first, especially if you're transitioning from a lot of false knowledge to true knowledge. So in my case, the example I just gave, I had a whole lot of knowledge that said there were no cures for cancer, quote unquote knowledge, but it was false knowledge. So as this new truth of a cure for cancer started to expand and explode in my mind, it started to destroy all this false knowledge. And anytime your beliefs are threatened or challenged, your beliefs literally help you organize yourself in reality. So literally the thing that helps you stay sane in reality are your beliefs. When you learn new truths, those truths disturb your beliefs, and it often feels unsettling. But then if you continue that active philosophy process, then you have a new state of order that is created, and then that state of order feels really good, way better than you did before, because now you have a better lens to understand the world around you. So now we're just going to review all this real quick. Over unity consciousness is the ability to receive an idea and generate many pieces of true intrinsic knowledge therefrom via active philosophy. Abstract knowledge acts as a container to organize specific knowledge coherently. So it's a fractal consciousness mechanism. True intrinsic knowledge sets are sticky, organized naturally via contemplation. A high order abstraction, or a creator-creation concept, is required as the grand master organizing principle of all information. So you need to have that true, accurate, and ever-expanding true and accurate concept of a creator to propel your awakening forward progressively. Fractal consciousness is the tuning process of expanding and purifying gained knowledge, letting one attain greater access to all information in the 0 point. Paradigm shifts occur when radical reorganization of knowledge takes place, resulting in a change in subjective experience. You literally start to see the world differently when you have a spiritual awakening, because the totality of your knowledge has been enhanced and changed and become more organized. Wisdom is the application of knowledge effectively. The output of an individual who has over unity consciousness becomes progressively wiser. They desire things that benefit themselves and others and actually carry them out effectively. So that's what I mean by true sovereignty. So as you progress and you gain the self-mastery, you eventually gain true sovereignty here. All right, so now we're going to talk about a path to a golden age. How can we use these principles to actually make the world a better place? Well, let's discuss this idea of unity of unique diversity. Now, this concept is true in free energy devices, but we're going to use it, we're going to try to understand it in terms of a society now. So before we do that, let's just absorb this concept perfectly. So strength and power of a free energy device, an individual or a society, is directly dependent on how well the parts work together. Diversity refers to a range or a variety of different things. Unity refers to the state of being joined as a whole, many becoming one. So a unity of unique diversity in this case refers to a group of unique objects or beings forming a strong unit. Now, what's interesting is that the more unique the components, the harder it is to harmonize, but the stronger the unity formed therein. Here we have an example. I believe this is a picture of a wall from Pumapunku. This is one of those ancient megalithic walls. And this is like an earthquake-proof wall. This wall has been around for a very long time. It's extremely stable in structure. And one of the reasons it's so stable is because each of the blocks is unique. And each of those unique blocks works perfectly together. Like, look how, it's like these blocks, when they were placed together, they were like sticky, like pieces of Jello. And they just formed this beautiful joint that is so perfect that you can't fit a human hair through these joints. That's how well the unity is. So if you think about it, individuals, we're the same. As we gain self-mastery, we're going to become different from everybody else. If we specialize, like, let's say I really want to study philosophy. It's kind of what I do, is I study philosophy, law, and psychology. So I've got a lot of specific knowledge there. But you might study, I don't know, free energy devices. So now you've got really good knowledge about free energy device. And then another person, they study how to build houses, let's say. And another person, they study how to, they study spirituality. They study things like astral projection. So we've got all this different sets of knowledge. And if we all throw each other in a room and we're like, okay, well, how can we work together with each other? It's going to take some time. We're going to have to get on the same page. We're going to have to communicate. We're going to have to learn how to communicate effectively. We're going to have to learn how to work with each other honorably, to respect our rights and our free will. And it's going to take some time. We're going to have to work out our differences. But once we do that, the strength of the unit that we have formed is going to be well nigh unstoppable. So that's the power of self-mastered individuals. Conversely, when you got people who aren't all that self-mastered, they don't necessarily know how to work with each other. You get like kind of a rabble of random people, and they barely can do anything with each other, and there's not a whole lot of strength there. So, okay, so unity of unique diversity in consciousness. So in consciousness, uniqueness refers to progress in self-mastery, personality growth, and development. The more self-mastered the individual, the more unique they are. The most influential people on earth gained that skill, differentiated them from others. So if you think about the people that are the most prolific, the most accomplished, they're really different from other people, aren't they? We tend to describe them as eccentric or maybe odd, and we kind of are fascinated by them. You know, you look at people like Leonardo da Vinci, and the guy was doing all sorts of amazing things. He was like taking notes that were mirror imaged and reversed, so you had to use a mirror in order to see them and decode them properly. And he created this whole other system for hiding his information. I actually forget the term for it, but it's a way of embedding and encoding information, encryption. So really different people. So as we gain mastery, we become very different. So what society's job is, the job is to create a system of law, culture, and trust that can coordinate all of the unique desires and passions of the progressively stronger, smarter, and industrious population that is gaining mastery. In this sense, society is the fractal field that harmonizes all the component individuals. The law and the legal system act as the identity layers of a society where mutual values govern social behavior. that particular statement, this is like the capstone of everything that we've been talking about here. So let me just break this down briefly for a moment here. How do we as individuals take all this individual wisdom? I have no doubt that everybody who's hearing these words right now and my voice has their own amazing set of knowledge and wisdom that they're developing in their lives. But we're different. You know, I've never met you. I don't know what your values are. I don't know what your beliefs are. I don't know what you're into. I don't even know if you know how to communicate or if you're willing to talk to me. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to work out. But if we learn how to communicate with each other, then we can express our ideas in a compassionate, kind way. And then those ideas can allow us to form connections and unity with each other so that then we can actually work with each other and create. So we don't, this method, this technique for creating harmony, this isn't something we have to invent. This is, I mean, people have been working together to do things on planet Earth since humanity has been around. Granted, we've lost and things have been lost throughout the ages, but for the most part, this information, this magic recipe for creating perfect unity so people can work together has survived the ages. The Cabal know it. The Cabal have it, and they use it to organize themselves. Despite the fact that the Cabal are quite, and the deep state are quite, infighting with each other, or bellicose, they work with each other because they've learned honor. They've learned respect. They've learned how to respect each other to a certain extent. So what I'm suggesting is that if we as individuals want to gain the amazing abundance and rewards of having a golden age society, we need to learn the recipes and the tools that allow two free will beings to work together. There is a knowledge set that describes that. It's called the law, specifically the law of contracts. When you understand what a contract is and you understand how all those components of a contract work, you literally have the master recipe to create harmony and order that will allow us to do anything that we set our minds to. Anything that is possible, we can make possible through our cooperative efforts. Let's see, I'm running a little short on time here, so I'm going to breeze through this section a little bit. This is Searle's magic square. So John Searle, he created the Searle effects generator, which is a free energy device. Let me just check the chat here. Yes, exactly. Imagine 7 billion people working harmoniously together. What could we accomplish? Well, in order to do that, we have to be brave. We have to learn tolerance. This is the reason why free speech is so vitally important. If we don't have free speech, then we can't share ideas. If we can't share ideas, then we can't get on the same page. If we can't get on the same page, then we can't work together in harmony with each other. It's like taking a whole bunch of musicians in an orchestra, giving them all different pieces of the music, and then demanding that they all play perfectly together. Of course they're not going to play perfectly together because they're not on the same page. But if they worked out their differences, if they all got on the same page, what could they do? They could make beautiful music. Let's make beautiful music together through embracing these realities. So, okay, so now just to really understand this point even more mathematically, let's imagine that each of these numbers in this magic square represent a person, a unique person. How do we make sure that we can arrange this magic square, these numbers, so that the output or the numbers that will be added on the outside all add together? So I'm just going to kind of skip ahead a little bit here. In their current formation, 1, 2, 3, and 4 add up to 10, 5, 6, 7, and 8 add up to 26, 9, 10, 11, 12 add up to 42. And then if we take the diagonal, we have 1, 6, 11, 16, that adds up to 34. So what the challenge is, how can we rearrange these numbers so that we always get the same value on the output? Well, there's a way to do it. And this is the way to do it. So if we do this, if we rearrange the numbers as such, then what ends up happening is we get the same output throughout. So what this means, what this is representing in a kind of parable or allegorical or symbolic fashion, is that when we take the time to create internal harmony within our social structures and our social units, all the various types of social groups out there, whether it's family, whether it's a professional association, whether it's the people in your township, whether it's the people in a nation, whether it's the people on a planet, when we spend the time to work out how to do that, then we can all work together to create this harmonized output. And what this harmonized output indicates is abundance. We can create a lot of abundance. So Social harmony emerges as self-mastered people work together coherently or honorably to produce goods and services. Contractual principles guide two or more free will beings to honor each other's rights and work together in trust non-destructively. So one of the things that happens when we talk about morality, morality for the individual are things you should not do, right? So you should not steal. You should not kill other people. You should not cheat. You should not smear a person's reputation. And when you do that, when you accept those things you should not do, you actually grant freedom to somebody else. So this is why when a society becomes more moral, it becomes more free. So I've heard this I first heard it from Mark Passio. He described this beautifully. He said there's an equation we can use. And basically, the relationship between morality and freedom is this. It's directly proportional. The more morality that exists in a society, the more individuals willingly restrict their actions to respect the rights of others, which is what moral actually is, the greater the freedom that increases in that society. And if you think about it, that's exactly how it should work. If I have rights, the only reason my rights allow me to do things is because you respect my rights. If I have a piece of land and I have an apple orchard on my land, if you just come in and you steal my apples, well, you're not respecting my rights to the property that I've been developing and that I've been using to grow and I've been caring for. But if you come and ask me for the apple, you've respected my rights. Now you give me the freedom to give it to you instead of stealing it from me. And that respects and it creates freedom and it creates prosperity. It creates better social structures. So the harmony imperative. Free energy devices harmonize their components together to produce over unity. Life harmonizes unique organs and cells. So your body is itself a beautiful tapestry of harmony. Consciousness harmonizes knowledge. So facts and other disparate pieces of knowledge slowly weave together through active philosophy. Societies harmonize individuals via honorable contracts so that the whole society works as one organism. So honor, law, these are the keys to creating social abundance. So social abundance or social over unity occurs when the truth and honorable conduct within any given group increases to the point that they produce more goods and services than they need to survive. Over unity of material goods and services. I didn't have time to include this in here. I wish I did, but there's a reason why we use a debt-based money system on our world. It's because it forces the individual to go out and work, because if they don't, they're going to die or their quality of life is going to be reduced. But if every individual embraced their responsibility, okay, and they actively developed themselves, then they would all develop the capacity for over unity consciousness as individuals, and then we would be able to work together in trust. So we wouldn't need a debt-based money system. Now we'd have a credit-based money system. And a credit-based money system basically says, well, we know that because you have the potential to do good things in the world and you're going to use your mind and consciousness in honor and in trust with all others, that we're just going to give you the energy you need to do all the amazing things that we know you're going to do. And now, once we transition into a credit-based monetary system, which we actually had the ability to do technologically back in the 1850s, now that is a stepping stone to the idealized moneyless society, where literally the love and fellowship and trust that we have in each other is the monetary system. It is the currency. All right, so wrapping all this up, with the philosophy of abundance in hand, our individual, interpersonal, and worldly problems can be solved. We need only seek for the order-making knowledge in the universe, such as law, psychology, and philosophy. Law incorporates science. Knowledge derived from science can be applied to make technology, free energy devices. Law is the will of the Creator revealed to the creation. Mastery of truth leads to an understanding of law. Law is the ultimate guide for personal fulfillment and social harmony. Your choice to master yourself is the ultimate gift to the Creator and the creatures in creation, and the surest way to improve your life and the lives of others. What will you choose? All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. It was a wonderful presentation. Let me just answer this one question. Yes, exactly. Stenography is I had a question, was Da Vinci using stenography to hide information or encode information in plain sight? That's exactly what he was doing, stenography. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this presentation. I hope you liked it. Let me just check the chat to see if there's anything, questions or anything like that. Nope. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and link the book I was talking about in the chat, so just give me 1 second here. So while I'm doing that, I will say if you want to know more about my work, Stillness in the Storm, if you go to my website, stillnessinthestorm.com, you can find all of my work there. I post a lot of news updates and things like that. I also write very deep, verbose, long, intense articles. So if you want to know that, it's kind of like the nuggets of wisdom I've been accumulating for many years. I put them out periodically, and I will be eventually creating a separate website for all of that. But for the time being, if you go to stillnessinthestorm.com and you click Start Here, that's kind of like the choice pieces of information that I've been gathering over the years. All right, so let me find this book, Epistemology. Come on. There it is. Okay. And there we go. So there is a link to that book. Can't see the comments. I can't see the comments. Your comment about the book on philosophy. Thanks. Okay, great. Hopefully it's all there. I think everybody should see the link. So again, that's the book on it. The book, if you don't want to get it on Amazon, it's called How Do We Know? An Introduction into Epistemology. As far as I'm concerned, I know this doesn't sound as flashy as like extraterrestrials or deep state or QAnon, or I mean, all those things are great. But as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, the thing that is the most important for us is to learn how to use our consciousness properly. We have to learn how to use philosophy properly, and epistemology is a great way to do that. So it's okay. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Much appreciated. I look forward to the next one. I will be giving that in May. That's going to be an in-depth presentation on a lot of the more social aspects of how we can actually create a golden age society. So it's something I'm very excited about, and that comes from my study of extraterrestrials and philosophy and spirituality in general. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and take care.